The story begins with the protagonist introducing himself as Mao, the king of a labyrinth that feeds on people's emotions by creating dungeons. When people hear the word dungeon, they usually imagine something cruel and terrifying. They picture a vicious demon or death waiting at the end of fear and despair. He acknowledged that those ideas were not wrong. However, the dungeon he created was different. It was a city. Instead of feeding on despair and fear, it drew strength from hope and smiles. It was a place where demons and humans lived together in harmony, known as Avalon. The story then shifts back in time. He found himself inside a silent room with towering walls rising high above him. The space felt vast and unfamiliar. He looked around, confused, wondering where he was. Before he could understand his surroundings, a deeper question surfaced in his mind. He began to question who he was. At that moment, a lady suddenly appeared before him. She had fox ears and carried herself with calm confidence. She approached him and stated that it seemed he had finally awakened. The man was startled by her sudden presence. He looked at her, unsure and confused, trying to understand what was happening. Without warning, something began to form from her shadow. It slowly took shape, emerging into the room as a massive lion-like monster. The creature's presence was overwhelming. He was caught off guard and stumbled backward, falling to the ground in fear. The beast immediately leaped toward him. In panic, he cried out as it passed close enough to strike a few strands of his hair. The monster landed and growled before charging at him once more. His thoughts raced as he desperately searched for a way to survive. Fear pressed heavily on him as the beast closed in. Then, without fully understanding why, a single word escaped his mouth: create. In that instant, a gun materialized in front of him. He stared at it in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Acting on pure instinct, he grabbed the weapon and fired repeatedly at the beast's face. The shots rang out in quick succession. The lion-like monster disintegrated almost immediately, vanishing into nothing. Silence returned to the room. Still shaken, he stared at the gun in his hand, confused about what it was and how it had appeared. The lady with fox ears calmly clapped her hands. She explained that create was a skill that used magic to materialize objects from his memory. The amount of magic required depended on the weight of the item being created. He soon learned that he could not create anything that was alive or anything already coded in magic. As he looked at the fox-eared lady, he questioned the idea of memory. A faint sense of nostalgia had stirred within him earlier, yet he did not even know who he was. The feeling lingered, unclear and distant. The lady informed him that he had passed. She offered her congratulations for the birth of a new demon king and declared that his name was Demon King Prosel. She then introduced herself as the Demon King of Beasts, Marcosius. She allowed him to call her Marco. Like him, she was one of the demon kings. He was surprised by this revelation and wondered whether she knew him from before. Marco made it clear that she did not know him personally. She had only been informed about him by higher authorities. He then questioned what a demon king truly was. Marco decided that it would be easier to show him rather than explain. She instructed him to follow her. They entered another room where a crystal ball rested at the center. He stared at it closely, and to his surprise, he saw his own reflection within it. He questioned whether the face he saw was truly his. As he reached out, intending to touch the crystal, Marco stopped him and told him to hold it instead. She explained that it would be better not to touch it carelessly. The crystal was the core of her dungeon and the source of her power. If it were ever destroyed, she would not die, but she would lose all of her power. He then asked whether he possessed a crystal of his own. Marco informed him that he did not have one yet, so there was no need for concern at that moment. Marco continued explaining the role of demon kings. They were leaders of demons. They created dungeons and ruled over them. Their purpose was to entice humans to enter their dungeons. From the strong emotions and life force of those who entered, they collected dungeon points, known as DP. Gathering DP was the responsibility of a demon king. Marco further explained that until he left the nest, she would act as his parent and support him throughout the year. After that, she handed him a medal and declared that this marked the beginning of Prosel's dungeon creation. They began with the formation of demons, who served as guardians of the dungeon. These demons would steal the emotions and lives of outsiders, something necessary for the dungeon's existence. Demons were brought to life by combining two metals, which a demon king could create once each month. The type of demon that appeared depended on the attributes of the metals used. For example, Marco's beast metal could spawn a demon that ruled over beasts. A fire metal could produce a demon that governed fire, and other attributes worked in similar ways. However, when Prosel created a metal, he discovered something unusual. He had the ability to change the attribute of the metal according to his own will. In addition to changing a metal's attribute, he also discovered that he could freely choose what kind of demon to spawn from countless possibilities. However, there was a drawback. Creating such a demon required the use of 3 metals instead of 2. This was not a flaw but rather part of a larger plan. Marco was surprised that he could produce a demon that required magic equal to 3 metals. She found the situation increasingly interesting and decided that she would gather metals from other demon kings for him as well. In simple terms, Prosel now had the ability to spawn a demon far stronger than normal, shaped exactly as he desired. Prosel decided that he wanted to create an auspicious demon. Using the attributes of Beast, Fire, and Create, he raised his hand and cast Synthesize. A bright light gathered in his palm. As the light shone, he questioned himself about what he truly wanted. What was he seeking from this new life? After thinking carefully, he realized that he needed a friend. On the day he was born as a demon king, he had felt a quiet loneliness that made him shiver. He wanted someone who could grow with him and remain by his side forever. From the light, a girl appeared before them. She was a rank S celestial fox. When she opened her eyes, she saw Prosel and Marco looking at her. She smiled and immediately ran toward Prosel, wrapping her arms around him and calling him daddy. Prosel was surprised by the way she addressed him. He thought that she was not entirely wrong, yet it still felt strange. He had wanted a friend. Marco observed that his deeper consciousness must have desired something beyond what he consciously understood. The girl then introduced herself as a Tenko and mentioned that she did not yet have a name. She wished for Prosel to give her one. Before Prosel could respond, Marco quickly covered his mouth and stopped him. She warned that he could not afford to be careless around foxes. She explained that the first 3 demons named by a demon king would become contracted demons. Such beings formed a special connection with the demon king's soul, and that bond could not be undone. Because of that, naming a demon recklessly was not wise. Prosel accepted this and decided that he would give her a name only after learning more about her abilities and personality. The fox girl agreed and declared that she would do her best until he approved of her. With that settled, Marco stated that since he now had a partner, he should enter the whirl of chaos. It was a place where low-level demons spawned endlessly. There, he could test the fox girl's strength and allow both of them to gain valuable battle experience. They moved toward the chaotic waters. Bubbles began rising to the surface. Without warning, a massive monster emerged. At once, the fox girl, Tenko, leaped forward and prepared to fight. Tenko immediately cast her gold dance skill and defeated the monster in a single instant. The creature had no chance to resist. Prosel acknowledged how impressive her strength was. Tenko responded by waving at him with visible energy. Watching her performance, Prosel felt that he could not allow himself to fall behind. He activated his Create skill, and a rifle materialized in front of him. Without hesitation, he took hold of it and began firing at the monsters emerging from the whirl of chaos. Each shot struck from a distance with precision. Marco observed the scene with surprise. She had not expected such effectiveness from a weapon that could attack from so far away. The impact and accuracy left a strong impression on her. Tenko then leaped toward Prosel and looked closely at the rifle in his hands. She found the weapon remarkable. She expressed her desire to have one as well, but something suited to her style. Attacking from afar did not match her preference. She wanted something louder and more direct. Soon after, she appeared holding a shotgun and fired directly into the faces of the monsters. The blasts were forceful and immediate. Marco reflected that she had considered something like this earlier when she first tested him. Even so, she admitted that the weapon was impressive. Although she did not fully understand its details, she now grasped how it functioned, and that understanding was enough. That realization brought her relief. Afterward, Marco informed Prosel that she would return ahead of him. If he needed anything, he could consult one of her acquaintances. She also reminded him that he should begin thinking seriously about what kind of dungeon he intended to create. Prosel quietly reflected on her words. Even if she told him to decide on a dungeon, it was not a simple matter. When he looked at Tenko smiling at him, he gently patted her head. He understood that once he built a dungeon, she would be forced to fight outsiders for her life. He had created her to be a friend, not a pawn meant to struggle endlessly within a dungeon. Because of that, he realized he needed to think carefully and design a dungeon where the children would not have to battle. As Marco prepared to leave, she reflected on Demon King Prosel and regarded him as a mysterious individual. There was something about him that did not align with what she had expected from a newly born Demon King. Even so, she acknowledged that his qualities were more than sufficient. In her view, if he continued as he was, then within a year he would likely grow into a fine Demon King. Marco added that for now, everything was fine. From her perspective, things appeared to be proceeding smoothly. She considered this to be the conclusion of her final task, and with that thought, she moved forward, satisfied that it would likely end without complication. Chapter 2. Prosel woke up and acknowledged that he was Demon King Prosel. He had been born as a Demon King, the master of a dungeon that fed on human fear and despair. Even so, he still did not know what kind of dungeon he wished to create. What he wanted was something different, something where Tenko could make friends, a safe place that would not harm anyone. He walked into the kitchen and found Marco cooking. She greeted him good morning and informed him that breakfast was ready. She explained that since she considered herself his parent, she wanted to try doing something a guardian would normally do. Prosel glanced at the pan and noticed that the food was badly burned. He questioned whether this was meant to be a form of punishment, which caused Marco to protest loudly that he was being unfair. The other girl commented that this was exactly why she had advised Marco not to attempt something she was unfamiliar with. As they ate, Marco mentioned that it had already been about a month since he awakened and asked about his progress. Prosel asked whether she was referring to the upcoming meeting that all Demon Kings would attend, the evening party. He wondered if she meant building up power before that event. She confirmed this. Marco explained that the main purpose of the evening party was to present the 10 new Demon Kings, including him. If he were looked down on, he would become a target. If he wished to protect Tenko, he needed to display his strength there. She added that it seemed he already had an idea in mind, especially considering his skeleton army. Prosel looked toward them thoughtfully. The day before, following Marco's suggestion, they had gone to Crimson Cave to gather more battle experience for both Tenko and himself. Inside the cave, Tenko observed that there were many enemies and that the heat was intense. Prosel noted that this was Crimson Cave, a dungeon without a Demon King. He explained that the crystal served as the source of power for Demon Kings and functioned as the dungeon's core. The Demon King could be seen as the caretaker of that crystal. If the crystal were shattered, the dungeon and the demons within it would perish. However, when only the Demon King disappeared, the crystal would lose control and continue spawning demons endlessly. That was exactly what had happened to Crimson Cave. Prosel explained that the former master of Crimson Cave had been the late Demon King of Fire. Now, Marco, who was merely an acquaintance of that fallen ruler, was the one overseeing the place. He acknowledged that such responsibility reflected a strong sense of duty. Without warning, Tenko let out a sharp cry, calling for her father and announcing that her weapon had broken. Prosel told her that they had been using it repeatedly without maintaining it properly. Tenko insisted there was no time to examine the damage and demanded a replacement immediately. Prosel calmly reassured her and reminded her that the reason they had come to Crimson Cave was not only for battle experience. He then called out for the skeleton army to gather. Tenko was left confused by the command. Moments later, the rattling sound of bones echoed throughout the cave as the skeletons assembled. The noise filled the surroundings, and Tenko screamed upon seeing them approach. Prosel clarified that this was also meant to test their practical applications. He proceeded to create a rifle for each skeleton and instructed the army to prepare themselves. At his order, they began firing at the monsters advancing through the cave. Prosel observed that even though the creatures were low-level and did not drop medals, the combination of his created weapons and the undead soldiers would still prove effective. Tenko urgently pointed out that monsters were also approaching from another direction. Prosel immediately commanded the skeleton army to turn left, ready their rifles, and fire again. The coordinated movement echoed with the sharp cracks of gunfire, while Tenko continued to shriek at the unsettling sight of the skeletons in action. Meanwhile, Prosel calmly sipped his tea and remarked that there was still much to accomplish. Marco looked at him with disbelief and questioned how he had even managed to survive up to this point. Prosel explained that the system would not function properly unless there was a monster capable of issuing precise commands to the undead. Marco responded with a small smile and decided that she would provide him with the earth metal, noting that it had strong affinity with the undead. Marco flicked the metal toward him and explained that, considering the create metal appeared once a month, he should already possess 2 by now. Since synthesizing through create required 3 metals, they would need to obtain 1 more from somewhere else. Tenko groaned and asked if he intended to make more of those frightening skeletons, admitting that she did not like them. She added that Marco and her father kept using complicated words during their discussions, and she could not follow what they were saying. Marco scolded her for speaking selfishly, but Procel gently patted Tenko on the head. Marco then dismissed it, saying it was nothing, and urged them to continue. Procel turned his attention to the imitation medal and asked about its nature. Marco explained that it was a replica of an original medal, something she could only produce once a month. However, the quality of the medal and the rank of the monster created from it would drop by 1 level. The process would require a vast amount of magic power, but as long as he had sufficient magic, he could create them without limit. Procel stated that he intended to test it. As he examined the medal, he questioned why it indicated human imitation rather than create imitation. He considered the possibility that the create imitation might transform into an imitation of whatever attribute he had previously altered. It felt similar to the time he created Tenko. He realized that he must have unconsciously changed create into a human because of his desire for companionship. He told Tenko to be encouraged, explaining that what he was about to make would become her younger sister. Procel activated create, human imitation, and human synthesize. A moment later, a girl appeared before them, an elder dwarf at rank 5. Marco stared in shock and questioned why it was an elder dwarf instead of an undead. Procel explained that by cleaning and modifying the firearms, he required a master blacksmith who could maintain the weapons without relying on his creatability. He added that he would address the matter of the undead at a later time. The elder dwarf remained standing quietly after her appearance. Marco remarked that this made it Lalacel, and that he would not be able to offer excuses if it happened a second time. Procel insisted that it was a misunderstanding. He explained that he had intentionally created her as a child so that Tenko could have someone her own age to befriend. Tenko immediately reached out and shook the elder dwarf's hands, happily announcing that she would call her Elchan. She then proudly introduced herself as Tenko, the older sister, and declared that El would need to listen to her. However, El's attention shifted to the weapon Tenko was carrying. She abruptly took hold of it and examined it closely. She observed that it was a weapon that fired metal balls using gunpowder. Its construction appeared simple at first glance, yet it contained a surprisingly deep design. Tenko attempted to protest and reclaim it, but El, asserting control, raised the gun and fired a shot upward. After pushing Tenko aside, El calmly acknowledged her understanding of her position. Her focus sharpened as she began thinking aloud about stronger weapons and producing more of them. The firearm had stimulated her imagination. With clear determination, she directed her confidence toward her master, Procel, signaling that the task should be entrusted to her. Marco observed that Procel had once again created a rather unusual individual. Procel responded that he believed enthusiasm was not a bad trait to have. Chapter 3. Procel explained that the master of blacksmithing was an elder dwarf named El, and that she was far stronger than he had first expected. From the time she was born, El had remained inside her room and rarely stepped outside. Before anyone fully realized it, the mine area had become filled with golems she had created on her own. Procel and Marco made attempts to speak with her from time to time. Whenever Marco suggested that El should join everyone for meals once in a while, El responded by pointing a gun directly at Marco and glaring at her, making it clear that she did not want interference. Procel regarded her as a truly strange girl. At that point, Marco turned her attention to Procel and asked him what day it was. When he wondered whether it was the evening gathering where the Demon Kings met, she confirmed it and presented him with formal wear prepared for the event. It was intended for the Demon King Prel's formal occasion. She had made it carefully so that he would not be looked down on by the other rookies and the older Demon Kings attending the evening party. The demon girl explained that she had prepared it herself and looked to him for his reaction. Procel observed that the outfit was somewhat excessive and difficult to move in, though it was not entirely uncomfortable. He then complimented Marco, noting that she looked very beautiful. Marco reacted with satisfaction at his kind words. Tenko then questioned where her own dresses were. Marco responded that there was no need for a demon to have one, before turning her attention back to Procel and asking about El's current condition. Procel replied that El was the same as always and that he did not think she intended to attend. Tenko expressed that they were not doing well in understanding Elchan. Marco agreed, mentioning that Tenko had been visiting El's place recently, and she asked if Tenko had learned anything. Before the matter could continue, a sudden blast interrupted them. The wall was destroyed as a golem burst through, carrying a crate in its arms. Procel was surprised to see El herself appear. She offered an apology for the delay and reported that the requested weapon modifications had been completed. Production had been increased, and all maintenance work had been finished as well. As Prosel opened the crate, he found several guns neatly arranged inside. He questioned whether she had truly worked on all of it within such a short time, wondering if that was the reason she had stayed in her room the entire time. Tenko happily revealed that this was not everything. Prosel then noticed the weapon Tenko was holding and asked if it was the shotgun he had created. Tenko held it proudly and explained that she had asked L-chan to modify it for her. She described the 4-gauge as extremely impressive and mentioned the heavy use of mithril, though she stumbled over her words as excitement overtook her. L quietly appeared behind Prosel while Tenko continued expressing how amazing it was. L picked up one of the guns and identified it as E0-01S. She had used the Master Shotgun as the base model and increased its power by designing it to fire 4-gauge bullets. To handle the strain, she constructed the body with mithril, making it both lighter and stronger. As an additional improvement, she installed a convenient magazine and adjusted it to an easy-to-use semi-automatic mechanism. Marco asked for clarification. Prosel summarized that it meant the weapon could repeatedly fire bullets strong enough to blow people apart. Elle then presented the gun properly, declaring it the finest product that made full use of her knowledge, and urged Prosel to examine it more closely. Partway through, she suddenly stopped herself and apologized for becoming overly absorbed, admitting that she could not restrain herself when it came to weapons. Prosel assured her that it was acceptable. He realized that he had misjudged her. He thought that this was simply her first time trying to meet his expectations, and that she had been doing her best. He crouched down and acknowledged her effort, telling her that she had done well. In response, Elle called him daddy and expressed her happiness. Tenko immediately appeared at her side, questioning the way Elle had addressed him. Elle began to tremble upon hearing it repeated. When Tenko insisted that Elle had indeed used that word, Elle quickly pointed the gun in her direction, denying it and warning not to point the nozzle carelessly because it was dangerous. Prosel then stated that he had finished preparing for the evening party. He had done everything within his ability, and all that remained was to attend and enjoy the gathering. Marco questioned what he meant by enjoyment. Prosel explained that he had been thinking of the evening party as a valuable opportunity. He believed he might receive advice from older demon kings about dungeon creation. There were also 9 other newly born demon kings who had come into existence at the same time as him. Since they all shared the same situation, he felt certain they could get along well and perhaps even become lifelong friends. Marco smiled quietly to herself. She remarked that such an outcome might be pleasant to some extent. As she did, monsters began to appear behind her. Prosel and Tenko reacted in shock. Tenko quickly grabbed a gun and prepared to fire at the monsters, only to freeze when the creatures suddenly vanished. In the next moment, Tenko found herself restrained and bound. Marco stated that if Prosel truly believed what he had just said, then he was still far too naive. Without warning, monsters seized Prosel and Elle from behind, gripping them firmly at the back of their necks. Prosel was caught off guard by their sudden appearance. The pressure they gave off felt overwhelming, and he sensed a magical presence identical to Marco's. In that instant, he understood that these monsters were Marco's contracted demons, Arachne Armorite, traitorous Kurayami, and Lion Griffin Gurugina. As Prosel helped Tenko back to her feet, Marco commented that the display had been somewhat rough, but that it reflected the true nature of the evening party. At that moment, a voice echoed through the air, addressing them as children of stars. Marco noted that the timing was far from ideal. She identified it as the invitation to the evening gathering. In the blink of an eye, they were teleported away. Prosel found himself standing in a vast garden beneath a bright blue sky, surprised by the peaceful scenery. Marco directed his attention behind him. When he turned around, he was left stunned. Before them stood the grand palace of the Demon King. Marco explained that this was the stage of the evening party, the place where the creator of the Demon Kings resided. They were standing directly in front of the Demon King's palace. She admitted that she had been unable to explain it earlier. Prosel responded that he understood. After witnessing Marco's demons and now standing before this immense castle, he realized something he had overlooked. Because Marco had always been cooperative and straightforward, he had nearly forgotten an essential truth. A demon king was a being who lured prey into a dungeon and fed upon the emotions of fear and despair. A gathering of such beings could not possibly be ordinary. They would likely approach one another with threats, especially toward those who allowed themselves to relax. Though it was called an evening party, this place was in reality a hunting ground. Marco confirmed that this was simply how it was. She urged Prosel forward, telling him that this was his crucial first stage. Chapter 4. At the party venue inside the Demon King's palace, one of the attendees expressed his satisfaction at being able to speak with Prosel. As a sign of acquaintanceship, he offered his imitation medal. Prosel responded that he was equally honored to have the opportunity to speak with him and handed over his own imitation medal in return. After the exchange, Marco remarked that Prosel was doing fairly well. Prosel quietly surveyed the surroundings. Even though many of the Demon Kings appeared refined and composed on the surface, he could sense that their murderous intent was real. He found himself wondering how the situation might have unfolded if Marco had not warned him in advance and put him on guard. Marco, meanwhile, seemed to be enjoying herself. For her, this gathering was nothing more than a reunion of old acquaintances. Aside from Elle and Tenko, Prosel had also brought the skeletons to accompany him, just as Marco had advised. He questioned whether they were drawing too much attention. Marco assured him that it was fine. She compared it to fine dining, explaining that the inexperienced could not distinguish between high-level and low-level monsters. Those who glanced at the skeletons and laughed were merely inexperienced and inferior. However, he was cautioned to be wary of anyone who could see through Elle and Tenko's true identities. Marco went on to explain that Prosel's create skill was an especially attractive ability. There would inevitably be demon kings who would attempt to destroy his crystal in order to steal his power. This gathering was the right time to determine who among them could be considered allies and who could not. Any demon king who destroyed his crystal would gain the ability to produce his metals. Prosel let out a quiet sigh, and Marco advised him not to make such a troubled expression. She assured him that she would continue to support him until he could stand on his own. Tenko then voiced her doubts about whether Marco herself could be trusted. Prosel was taken aback by her remark. Tenko pointed out that Marco was also one of the demon kings present, and if she were ever to become hostile, she would pose the greatest threat, especially since Prosel was constantly by her side. Marco responded with a small laugh, acknowledging Tenko's sharpness. She reassured them that any demon king chosen to take on the role of a parent would not fundamentally become that kind of threat. It was structured in such a way from the beginning. Prosel was left unsettled by Tenko's observation. Nearby, a girl with long ears moved quietly through the party venue. She did not fully understand everything happening around her, yet she could tell that the event had been arranged with great care. Another unfamiliar voice responded that such things were to be expected, and that everyone should simply continue enjoying the evening party. The long-eared girl let out a quiet snicker. While Marco and Prosel were in the middle of their conversation, a sharp smashing sound cut through the air. Laughter rose from the crowd, followed by a mocking voice asking what exactly this was supposed to be. Both Marco and Prosel turned toward the commotion. They saw two skeleton heads spinning carelessly on someone's hand. The same voice remarked that the attendant in question was nothing more than a skeleton, concluding that there must be a truly miserable demon king present. The speaker stepped forward and revealed herself to be the same long-eared girl from earlier. Holding one of the skeleton heads in her hand, she laughed again and remarked that she could not imagine anyone of the same generation as the demon king of Wind, Straussama, being reduced to such a state. Prosel stiffened at the mention of the same generation. He realized that she was also one of the newly appointed demon kings. Before he could fully process the thought, the long-eared demon casually tossed the skeleton head aside and continued her remark about the rest of the demons. Elle stared at her blankly and commented that something felt strange. She could not see through the girl's identity. From within the crowd, someone speculated that they must belong to a demon whose attendants were skeletons, and that they were likely nothing more than a C-rank Yako and a dwarf. The same voice dismissed them as pathetic and useless children. At that, Prosel's expression hardened, and he glared openly at the long-eared demon. He raised his voice in protest. In response, she lifted her demon medal. She stated that it was a wind imitation medal and declared that she would bestow it upon Prosel since they belonged to the same generation. She urged him to create one as strong and proud as her own contracted demons. As she finished, 3 demon types abruptly manifested out of nowhere. Marco observed Strauss from behind. Within her thoughts, she acknowledged the density of that magical power and recognized that this one was genuine. A wind demon king who had been absent for years had now appeared. Despite her inexperience, she had already walked straight into the skeleton trap. Marco then shifted her gaze toward Prosel. In her mind, she wondered what he intended to do. Prosel steadied himself internally, reminding himself to remain calm. He could not forgive the insult directed at Elle and Tenko, nor the mockery of his companions. However, he also recognized that this reaction had been part of their intended course of action. He forced himself to maintain composure. Suppressing his anger, Procel thanked Strauss for the medal and began to offer his in return. She cut him off immediately, stating that she had no need for it. She added that if she were ever to use his medals, failures like those might end up being created. At her insinuation, Procel's eyes narrowed. He asked who she thought she was. Strauss responded with a short, questioning sound. Procel's anger surfaced as he declared that from his perspective, her demons were far more of a failure than his own. Strauss froze in disbelief and questioned what he had just said. Procel raised his voice, daring her to repeat her earlier remark and warning that insulting his children would not be forgiven. Strauss countered that she had only spoken the truth. Procel replied that he understood now, concluding that she herself was a failure. He fixed her with a sharp glare. Her expression hardened. She seized his shirt in anger, unable to hold back her reaction. The two demon kings stood locked in a tense stare, hostility evident between them. Then a voice rang out across the hall, announcing the children of the stars. The proclamation declared that new children had been born and that their brilliance should be celebrated. The surrounding demons erupted into cheers. The announcer continued, explaining that for this banquet, they would be treated to entertainment. Procel stiffened. He recognized the voice. It was the same one that had spoken when they were invited to the Demon King's palace. Strauss, with a blank expression, informed him that it was the creator, adding that he truly knew nothing. She began to question what was meant by entertainment. Before she could finish, the creator made the next declaration. A set of newly appointed demon kings would now compete in battle, destroying one another's cores. Marco reacted in shock, unable to conceal her surprise at the announcement. The creator proceeded to name the first round. It would begin with the two who had been unable to restrain themselves. Demon King of Wind, Strauss, versus Demon King of Create, Procel. Strauss regarded the situation as ideal, believing it was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate who the true failure was. The creator instructed them to destroy and dominate as they pleased. In the next moment, Marco, Procel, Tenko, and El were transported into a white waiting room-like space. Marco reacted with visible frustration. Under normal circumstances, newly appointed demon kings were not permitted to construct dungeons before becoming independent. There was also an established rule of non-interference regarding other demon kings' dungeons. Yet now, they were being forced into war for the sake of entertainment. Her frustration deepened as she realized it did not end there. After the evening party, every demon king would be required to participate in at least one battle. All of it, she concluded, stemmed from simple boredom. Turning her gaze aside, she acknowledged how unreasonable it all was. Procel told her that it was too late to protest. The game utilized pseudo-crystals, not real ones. Moreover, the Demon King of Time would restore anything lost during the match. He resolved to treat this as a simulation, preparation for the inevitable real war that would one day come. He then mentioned that Marco had already seen through the situation earlier, which was why she had told him to prepare himself during the evening party. Marco moved behind him and embraced him lightly. She explained that she had heard rumors from previous demon kings. After that, she asked whether he had come up with a good idea for a dungeon. Procel responded awkwardly in the negative, though in his thoughts he admitted the opposite. His mind was a complete blank. His original intention had never been to fight. He had considered creating something unconventional, something that would not normally be called a dungeon. However, that approach would not work now. Strauss would undoubtedly attack with full force. In his thoughts, he resolved that he did not want El or Tenko to be injured. He also refused to lose to someone who had insulted them. What he needed now was a combat-oriented dungeon. A determined expression settled over his face as he accepted that he had to move forward with this plan. He reviewed the dungeon parameters. Within this game, only one level consisting of 3 floors was permitted. He began analyzing the structure of the dungeon. The more complicated a dungeon was, the more durable it would become. However, anything overly elaborate or glamorous would consume a significant amount of magical power. In his current state, he was capable of creating most things, yet constructing something excessively complex and fortified would only waste precious time. He questioned himself about which combination best suited his current combat strength. El and Tenko possessed remarkable abilities. There was no doubt about that. However, the rest of his forces were unreliable. The skeleton army followed orders without independent thought, and El's golems, while sturdy, had clear limitations. There were also the firearms El had mass-produced. In addition, he now possessed a newly granted Create medal prepared specifically for this game by the creator, along with the Death and Wind imitation medals he had received during the evening party. The issue was that none of them worked together smoothly. The golems could serve as defensive units, but they were slow. He considered placing them in a narrow hallway to prevent Strauss from escaping. Yet he quickly dismissed the idea. That approach would only stall the situation rather than secure a decisive outcome. Procel stared at his system window, murmuring to himself as he reviewed the available options. Then a realization struck him. Marco stepped closer, noticing the shift in his focus. She moved beside him and glanced at the system window. What she saw caused her expression to change with surprise. She urged him to treat the situation with greater seriousness. Procel turned toward them and declared that this was the plan. Elle and Tenko looked at him without expression, waiting for an explanation. With visible energy, he announced that this would be his dungeon. Chapter 5. The Demon King of Creation, Procel, and the Demon King of Wind, Stolas, had agreed to take part in a pseudo-war as entertainment for the evening gathering. As the moment approached, Procel recalled the creator's earlier announcement about the Children of the Stars. The battle was about to begin. The rules were straightforward. Each Demon King would construct a one-level dungeon with 3 floors within the vast white space. Victory would belong to the one who either shattered the crystal hidden deep within the opposing dungeon or defeated the opposing Demon King. The one left standing would be crowned the winner. The demons sent to invade the enemy dungeon would press the attack, while those assigned to defend their own would become the key to securing victory. Tenko stood outside the dungeon created by Strauss and observed its appearance. It was flashy, clearly reflecting Strauss's personality. She then turned her thoughts to her father's dungeon. Even from the outside, it did not appear special. Its interior was likely the same. The design was plain and simple, but that simplicity could be its strength. However, what concerned her more was the overwhelming number of demons in Stola's army. There were at least 100 of them. She had heard from Marco that the wind attribute possessed a copy ability, allowing the creation of clones. That would explain the numbers gathered before them. Tenko remarked that it looked like a great deal of effort and wondered what Procel intended to do. Procel's response was simple. They would watch. Strauss glanced toward Procel's side and judged his dungeon to be trashy, no different from the Demon King himself. At that point, the creator declared that both sides appeared ready. The command to begin the war rang out, signaling the new generation of the Children of the Stars to fight. Strauss immediately began chanting teleportation magic. In the next moment, she arrived inside a chamber that contained a crystal core and a throne. She reminded herself of the conditions of defeat. If the crystal were destroyed, or if the Demon King personally were defeated, the battle would be lost. Naturally, protecting the crystal in the deepest part of the dungeon would be the expected strategy. However, she had prepared more than that. She was not alone. A clone of herself had already been created, and that duplicate moved swiftly, flying out from the throne room. By using her wind ability, she could project her spirit and take command directly from the front lines. Strauss then summoned a demon named Rosalite. Rosalite appeared with a bright expression and confirmed her presence. She reported that the preparations for the attack were complete. Strauss shifted her focus toward Procel's side and asked about their movements. Rosalite hesitated briefly before pointing toward Procel's team. Strauss reacted with surprise. Rosalite explained that they had not shown a single sign of movement. She further added that, as far as she understood, they were not permitted to fight within the white space itself. Frustration rose within Strauss. With no other option, the only path to victory was to destroy the crystal. That meant there was no way to directly defeat Procel in combat. The situation struck her as unfair. Rosalite then observed that Procel appeared to have no intention of defending his dungeon or launching an attack on theirs. Strauss questioned whether Procel lacked motivation, or whether he was simply confident in his ability to protect his dungeon. She gestured toward her forces and decided that it did not matter. She ordered all of the copies along with half of the main troops to advance. They would invade the enemy base immediately and eliminate them at once. Confidence showed in her expression as her demons launched forward. She declared that they would bring ruin to their opponents and then commanded the first squad to charge. The demons flew directly toward the cave entrance, only to crash headfirst into the cave wall. Strauss observed the structure carefully. The entrance was extremely narrow. It seemed that only a few could pass through at a time. Turning to Rosalite, she concluded that regardless, the invasion had already begun. Rosa Light acknowledged the situation and prepared to relay information through telepathy to the demons who had already entered the dungeon. Before she could continue, Strauss interrupted with a confident expression, deciding that reinforcements should simply be sent based on how the situation developed. In her mind, it was only a matter of time before Procel's crystal would be destroyed. Her gaze shifted toward Procel and his team, who remained completely still. He truly was not making a single move. Rosa Light observed that it did not even seem like a proper contest. Strauss then inquired whether there had been any contact from inside the dungeon. Rosa Light reacted with confusion. There had been no response at all from their side. Both of them stared ahead, bewildered by the silence. A trace of concern surfaced as Strauss questioned whether the invading demons had been defeated. Rosa Light quickly dismissed the idea. Even if they had fallen, there should have been some form of contact. To be certain, Rosa Light suggested sending in the second squad. However, Strauss was already in motion, flying straight toward Procel's dungeon before Rosa Light could finish, prompting Rosa Light to call after her. As she advanced, Strauss sensed that something was off. Just before entering the dungeon, she glanced at Procel. He showed no reaction to her approach. Observing him closely, she concluded that he was a weak demon king, incapable of even detecting her spirit form. Strauss passed directly through the dungeon wall. At that moment, someone questioned Procel about what he had done. Procel responded casually, wondering if Strauss had just entered his dungeon. Tenko clarified that it was Strauss's spirit form and then asked whether he was able to see spirits. Procel answered that he could not see spirits. However, because the dungeon was connected to his own consciousness, he was still able to sense Strauss's presence within it. Inside Procel's dungeon, Strauss found herself staring down a long, narrow hallway. There was nothing elaborate about it. She remarked on what she saw, criticizing the laziness of such a design. The low ceiling and tight space were clearly not suited for her demons. Then a realization struck her. Her demons were nowhere in sight. Her attention shifted toward the far end of the corridor. In the distance, she noticed a figure holding weapons. She focused her gaze and identified it as a golem. It appeared to be gripping something in its hands. Without warning, the hallway transformed into a gruesome scene. The floor, walls, and even the ceiling were splattered with blood. The bodies of her demons lay scattered everywhere. The sight froze her in place. She struggled to process what stood before her. The sudden carnage left her unable to understand what had just occurred. Then she sensed movement from behind. Turning her head, she saw the second squad arriving to report their presence. The sudden appearance caused her to flinch. In the next instant, the hallway returned to its original state. The blood and corpses vanished completely, leaving no trace behind. Silence filled the corridor once again. She stared into the darkness at the far end and saw two golems begin to move. One of them raised its weapon and aimed directly at them. A burst of gunfire followed. Bullets tore through the air and struck the demon standing behind her. Strauss turned to look at them, but no words came. Confusion repeated in her mind as she tried to grasp what was happening. Anger rose within her, yet she found herself unable to act. Outside the dungeon, Procel felt a powerful aura surge outward. He clutched his chest as he sensed it flowing through him. It was Strauss's fear and despair. Tenko looked at him with confusion. He dismissed it calmly, claiming it was nothing. Then Procel lifted his gun near his face. A faint, sharp smile formed as he informed his group that it was time for them to move. It was now their turn. Chapter 6. Some time before, a dead demon lay motionless on the ground. Strauss stared at it, confusion and fear filling her eyes as she struggled to understand what she was seeing. Her thoughts were shaken and unfocused, but the sound of a clap reached her ears and pulled her back. The one who acknowledged her was Asteros, who had judged that she had passed. Under the Demon King of Dragon, Asteros, Strauss was born as the Demon King of Wind, known as Strauss or Stolas. At that time, she did not even know her left from her right. She had gone through many moments where she felt like running away from everything. Yet the demons bound to her contract remained beside her, supporting her through those difficult times. They believed in her, seeing her as someone they could be proud of, someone who would never lose to anyone. Because of them, Strauss made a firm decision. She chose to become a great demon king for their sake. As Procel continued to grow stronger, Strauss could only stare in disbelief. Before her eyes, the bodies of her demons piled up across the blood-covered floor. Her commandment had been completely wrong. She had believed that such a high-power attack could not be maintained for long. She had convinced herself that victory was possible if she overwhelmed the enemy with numbers. Acting on that belief, she sent nearly her entire army forward. Now, they had been completely annihilated. She thought that if things had been like this before the war even began, the outcome would have been different. Her mind returned to her earlier conversation with Astros. She had believed that her odds were better than that creation bastard. She could not accept being looked down on by someone who relied on low-level monsters like skeletons. Astros had evaluated Strauss' dungeon calmly. It was a gorge shaped into a maze, filled with pitfall traps and connected to a lava zone. It was a map that made effective use of her mobility and her ability to fly. It was not a bad design. However, Strauss' thoughts were not focused on that evaluation in this moment. Astros looked at Strauss and told her to give it her best. Whether the outcome became victory or defeat, it would still become a great experience for her. Strauss resisted those words, unable to accept the way it sounded as if her loss had already been assumed. A heavy sigh escaped from her as regret filled her thoughts. She wished she had taken Astros' words more seriously back then. Now it was too late. Everything had already gone too far. Everything was too late. A desperate scream reached her ears as Rosalit called out to her. Strauss found herself being held in the arms of that demon. She recognized Rosalit as one of her contracted demons. Confusion filled her mind as she realized something was wrong. She had left her demons waiting inside her dungeon, yet now she was here. Her eyes moved across the surroundings, and she realized that this place was outside that creation bastard's dungeon. Rosalit had heard Strauss scream and gathered everyone before coming here. Masamune, another of her contracted demons, informed her that the demon king of creation had already begun his advance. Rosalit explained that this was the reason they had taken Strauss out of the dungeon. When they did so, they had also witnessed the threat present on that floor. There was no better way to describe it other than calling it a nightmare. Rosalit continued her explanation, believing that the first floor was most likely the demon king of creation's strongest point. As long as they could overcome that floor, she believed there was still a chance for victory. Strauss looked at them in surprise, unable to hide her reaction. Masamune then raised another point, questioning whether the real ones, instead of copies, would be able to break through if they were the ones to enter. Strauss immediately rejected the idea. Against that floor, even the real ones would not be able to get through. Rosalit asked if there was any other possible way. Concern appeared clearly on Strauss' face as uncertainty filled her thoughts. Before she could fully respond, Masamune reassured her. Everything lost in this war would return eventually. With that in mind, there was no reason to hold back. He and the others were ready to strike fear into their enemy. They stood before her as the contracted demons of someone destined to become a great demon king. Tears began to form in Strauss' eyes as she looked at them. She quickly wiped them away, reminded once again of the resolve of her contracted demons. Their lives rested in her hands. She realized that she was not someone who would simply stand still and watch her friends die. Even if the chance was small, she had already thought of a way. Strauss pointed toward the steel pipe held by the golems, focusing on their weapons. She understood that the accuracy of an attack launched from above was not as precise. However, she also knew that lower accuracy did not mean safety. Rosalit acknowledged that fact, but pointed out that the distance between them and the golems still remained far. Strauss agreed with that observation. With that distance in mind, she presented the formation she had devised. The copy and the real Masamune would move forward and create a defensive wall of wind to block the incoming attacks. Behind that wall, the copy and the real Phobos would advance at high speed, with the copy of Phobos acting as a decoy. Strauss herself would position behind the copy of Phobos, while Rosalit would remain at the very rear, casting strengthening magic to support everyone. Strauss showed the plan to Masamune and made him understand the risk clearly. The farther forward someone stood, the lower their chances of survival would become. Masamune accepted this without hesitation, having already made his resolve. Rosalit also showed her readiness, standing with determination not only for Strauss but also for their fallen comrades. They prepared themselves to advance straight through the enemy's trap from the front. The golems quickly noticed their approach. Without delay, they raised their weapons and prepared to fire. Strauss gave the signal to begin. Masamune moved forward and raised a wall of wind. Rosalit cast strengthening magic across everyone. Masamune charged ahead as planned. Strauss understood that the demons who had been guarding her dungeon had been sent ahead as decoys. While the golems struggled to decide which targets to focus on, she and the others would use that moment to close the distance. Suddenly, an explosion erupted behind them, catching Strauss off guard. The ground itself had been trapped, revealing yet another layer of the enemy's defenses. With the decoy troops wiped out, there was nothing left to divide the golem's attention. Their aim would now focus entirely on Strauss and her group. Bullets tore through the air, some of them grazing Strauss as they passed. Masamune flew ahead at the front, placing himself between Strauss and the incoming attacks. He moved with the intent to protect everyone using the defensive wall of wind he had created. In the next instant, a bullet pierced through Masamune's head. The protection of the wind wall had failed to stop it. Strauss watched in shock as Masamune was struck down. His fall shattered the defense they had relied on. Still, they continued forward. They had already closed much of the distance, and Strauss believed they could still push through. But something was wrong. She noticed Phobos, his mouth foaming as his body weakened. Realizing the danger, Strauss immediately ordered both Phobos and Roselet to stop. The copy of Phobos collapsed onto the ground. The air around them had turned yellow. It was poison. With the last of his strength, Phobos' copy used his wind magic to disperse the poisoned air. His body blackened as the poison consumed him, but his final effort cleared the deadly air from their path. Strauss and the others rushed forward, passing his fallen form. Now that the poison was gone, their path was open again. Strauss focused ahead as another bullet flew past her face. Because they had stopped moving earlier, they had lost their momentum and could no longer dodge perfectly. Roselet suddenly moved in front of Strauss, placing herself directly in the line of fire. She took the incoming bullets onto her own body, shielding Strauss completely. Strauss watched in horror as Roselet was struck. Despite her injuries, Roselet endured. With what strength remained, she entrusted everything that followed to Strauss. Then, Roselet summoned a powerful wind. The force of it lifted Strauss and carried her forward, pushing her past the golems and into the next area. Roselet's body fell behind, left in the second area. Strauss continued forward, carrying the weight of Masamune and Roselet's sacrifices. The nightmare of the first area remained behind her. But she had made it through. Strauss looked back. She had only made it this far because of their brave sacrifices. Phobos was the only one remaining beside her now. The others were gone. She turned her gaze forward. What lay ahead made her question what she was seeing. It was as if all 3 floors existed there at once. Her eyes fell upon the golems, and the sight resembled something close to hell itself. In that moment, something within Strauss' eyes changed. That was the point where her heart broke. At the same time, Prosel, Tenko, and El advanced toward Strauss' base. They moved forward without hesitation. When Prosel reached her throne, Strauss stared at him in shock. He had already arrived. Prosel had predicted this outcome. He understood that Strauss' thoughts were easy to read. He knew she would send the demons protecting her dungeon to attack his forces. Because of that decision, his path forward had been left open, allowing him to advance without resistance. Tenko remained with him as they stood before Strauss. Prosel could feel everything that Strauss carried within her. Her love for her comrades and the grief of losing them had all reached him. He understood that once everything was over, all that had been lost would return. The battle had already reached its conclusion. He moved forward with the intent to destroy the crystal and end it. Strauss refused to accept that outcome. Her face darkened as the weight of her losses filled her. Her friends had been slaughtered. She would not allow herself to lose so easily. She brought forth the dragon metal. Its power surged through her, boosting all of her abilities while forcing her into an uncontrollable berserk state. She combined that power with her ultimate ace, determined to win against him and make up for the deaths of everyone she had lost. Strauss synthesized her power, taking on the form of the berserk emerald dragon. This was the genuine final battle against the Demon King of Creation. Chapter 7. The other Demon Kings spoke among themselves as they watched the clash between Strauss and Prosel with rising excitement. They reacted in amazement at the Demon King of Wind's trump card. They also noted that Prosel, despite being young, had summoned demons that were quite capable, yet now even they could no longer tell who would emerge victorious. Marco, growing uneasy as she observed the situation, called out to Prosel. The Emerald Dragon released a deafening roar toward Prosel's army. It was a jade-colored dragon born from the fusion of the wind metal and the dragon metal, one of the most powerful metals in existence. By surrendering its intellect to berserk fury, it gained overwhelming strength, enough to surpass even S-rank demons. Tenko showed clear concern as she looked toward Prosel. Prosel remained firm, already having informed them of the plan, and gave the signal to begin combat. Tenko immediately surged forward. El and Prosel advanced alongside her, firing their guns, but the bullets only flattened harmlessly against the emerald dragon's scales. Elle recognized that their attacks were ineffective. Prosul acknowledged the same reality, noting the dragon's incredibly tough scales. Even so, victory in war could be achieved through two conditions: either defeat the opposing demon king or destroy the crystal that served as their source of power. There was no need to confront the dragon head-on if another path existed. Tenko quickly reached the rear of the dragon, where Strauss's throne had been, but found it empty. She realized Strauss was gone. Prosul immediately understood the danger. Strauss had created an uncontrollable demon and would never remain in one place. Worse, the crystal had been swallowed by the dragon during its creation, leaving no alternative path to victory except defeating the dragon itself. Without warning, the emerald dragon swung its massive tail toward Prosul and Elle. Both were caught off guard by the sudden strike and were violently slammed into the wall. Tenko cried out as she saw Prosul and Elle struck down. She shot high above the emerald dragon, driven forward despite the danger. The dragon reacted immediately, opening its massive jaws toward her. Tenko fired directly into its mouth, but the attack failed to achieve any result. The dragon unleashed a powerful breath in response, blasting Tenko through the air and sending her crashing beside the injured Prosul and Elle. Tenko struggled to understand what was happening. Their attacks were not penetrating, and the dragon's scales were far too strong. Elle observed the same, but identified the true cause. The dragon was wrapped in an armor of wind, which greatly weakened the bullets before they could reach its body. Elle realized there was only one remaining option. She urged Tenko to use the EO-01SS true power, explaining that its full auto shot might be capable of breaking through. Tenko hesitated, uncertain. Elle understood the risk but accepted the reality. If they continued like this, they would be annihilated regardless. She entrusted the decision to Tenko. Tenko made her choice. As another attack came rushing toward them, all three moved quickly to evade it. Prosul questioned Elle, not knowing the weapon even had a full auto function. Elle revealed that it was still in the development stage. Using it would destroy the weapon itself, which was why she had avoided relying on it. However, she believed it was strong enough to pierce the dragon's wind armor. Tenko charged forward once more, positioning herself directly in front of the emerald dragon. The dragon had already noticed her and prepared its counterattack. Prosul watched closely and realized something unusual. The dragon was shedding its own scales. In the next instant, it whipped its tail. A violent storm erupted, carrying its hardened scales like deadly blades. The scales tore through Tenko as the wind roared around her. Prosul reacted in shock as he saw Tenko struck. Elle understood the mechanism immediately. The dragon had created a storm that weaponized its own scales, forming a deadly barrier that prevented anyone from getting close. Prosul struggled to find an answer, unsure of what they could possibly do against such overwhelming defense. Through the chaos, Tenko called out weakly as her injured body fell from the sky. She landed directly into Prosul's arms. Despite her condition, her focus remained on him, concerned for his safety. She recognized the dragon as a troublesome enemy. Elle, understanding what must be done, turned her attention to Prosul. She urged him to give Tenko a name. They realized they could not win under these conditions. However, if Tenko became a contracted demon, the situation could change. Tenko immediately objected to the idea. Elle questioned her resistance, unable to understand why she would refuse. Despite her injuries, Tenko forced herself to stand. She remembered the promise made at the very beginning, that she would be given a name once she had earned Prosul's trust. She refused to accept a name without proving herself first. To her, it would mean nothing if she could not even defeat a single dragon. Prosul was filled with conflict. He was about to call out to her, but his voice stopped as his eyes fell upon her wounded back. His thoughts returned to Marco's warning that choosing a contracted demon required careful judgment. While demons were generally obedient to their demon king, they still possessed intelligence and will. Marco had witnessed many cases where demon kings were betrayed by their own contracted demons, their positions reversed through deception. Tenko's kind were known to be intelligent demons. Prosul understood that he needed to determine whether he could truly trust her. In that moment, his hesitation disappeared. He resolved himself, knowing he could no longer hold back. He called out the name Kuina. Tenko turned back in surprise, unable to process what she had just heard. Prosul called the name again, declaring it as her true name. Kuina had become Prosul's first contracted demon. Kuina looked at him, overwhelmed by what had just happened. Prosul entrusted everything to her, believing in the bond they had formed. He placed his trust in her strength and in the friendship they had built from the beginning. Kuina responded with determination. At that instant, a brilliant white light engulfed her entire body. When the light faded, Kuina emerged transformed. Her presence had changed completely. The battle had now reached its true turning point. Chapter 8. Prosel saw Kuina after her transformation and immediately commanded the contracted demon Kuina forward. She responded with confidence, moving ahead without hesitation. The dragon launched another attack using its wind scales, but Kuina blocked the strike effortlessly. As a contracted demon, she stood as the Demon King's ace. Demon Kings possessed the ability to grant names to demons, and in return, those demons received immense power. Kuina's transformation ability had been strengthened through the Demon King's power, allowing her to surpass the Emerald Dragon and grow into her adult form. Kuina briefly turned her eyes toward El, expressing both apology and gratitude. She then ascended high into the air and aimed her gun downward, firing continuously. The Emerald Dragon let out a loud cry. Around the battlefield, the other Demon Kings watched in astonishment, and Marco smiled as she realized the war was reaching its end. From above, Strauss observed silently as Kuina delivered the finishing move, the Golden Dance, bringing the Emerald Dragon down. An announcement echoed across the arena, declaring the conclusion and naming the winner as the Demon King of Creation, Prosel. Immediately after, they were transported to the center of the stage. The other Demon Kings surrounded them with applause. Prosel soon noticed Marco approaching. She rushed forward and embraced him, expressing her excitement and praising his performance. Prosel reacted with surprise and embarrassment at her actions in front of everyone. Kuina quickly intervened and pushed Marco away, judging the behavior as shameless. Marco responded playfully, disappointed by the reaction. Prosel then made it clear that their victory was not achieved by his power alone. He pulled Kuina and El close, acknowledging that everything had been possible because of his friends. Marco watched them with a gentle smile. Prosel continued by recognizing Marco as well, acknowledging that she had supported him the entire time. Marco laughed, commenting on how heated she had become and how she was beginning to sweat. She decided to step away to enjoy the cool night breeze, encouraging the two battle companions to get along. Prosel questioned the meaning of battle companions, and his attention shifted to Strauss. He realized that her contracted demons had been restored, confirming that the Demon King of Time had returned them. Strauss stood nearby while Rosalit called to her, urging her forward. Strauss acknowledged this and then looked toward Prosel. She hesitated before expressing regret, admitting honestly that she had previously underestimated him. Prosel accepted her words calmly. He explained that after seeing the first floor of her dungeon with his own eyes, he never expected to overcome it so easily. Her dragon had brought him genuine fear, and he believed she had every reason to be proud of what she and her demons had achieved. He reflected on the despair he had felt during their battle and recognized the way she treated her demons as companions rather than tools. Prosel smiled and admitted that he was glad she had been his first opponent. He extended his hand toward her, offering friendship from that moment onward. Strauss looked at him, surprised, and realized that he was far kinder than she had expected. Prosel stared at Strauss in silence, taking in her reaction. Strauss accepted the situation, realizing there was nothing more to argue against. She expressed her own regret for having mocked him earlier. She acknowledged that the first defeat she had ever experienced had come from him, and she accepted it sincerely. They reached toward each other and shook hands, sealing the understanding between them. Strauss accepted the gesture gladly, feeling genuine happiness at having gained a friend through their battle. Asteros approached and gently patted both of their heads. He looked toward Prosel and expressed his gratitude as well. Having experienced defeat, he believed his daughter would continue to grow stronger because of it. Strauss reacted with surprise at Asteros's words. Asteros continued, offering a token of appreciation. He presented an original dragon medal along with a pigeon demon, explaining that it would allow them to exchange letters and remain connected. Strauss responded in kind, offering her original wind medal. She intended to write many letters in the future. Prosel accepted this without hesitation. Prosel then looked down at the items he had obtained and reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about the evening party and how he had been anxious about what would unfold. Now that it had ended, he realized it had been a meaningful and valuable experience. Asteros spoke again, expressing that being able to take part in nurturing a demon king like Prosel had been an honor. He added that Marco must surely feel proud, as it had been her final duty. Prosel immediately focused on Asteros's words, especially the mention of it being Marco's last. Astros questioned whether Procel had truly not been informed. Procel moved quickly through the long corridors, his thoughts racing. He recalled the truth about a demon king's lifespan, which lasted only 300 years. Once those 300 years ended, they disappeared without exception. Every 10 years, when new demon kings were born on the same day, the responsibility of guiding and nurturing them was entrusted to demon kings who were nearing the end of their own lifespan. Marco was already 299 years old. Procel had never known this, and no one had told him. Procel realized the truth and understood that Marco's remaining lifespan was less than 1 year. Panic overtook him, and he rushed toward her, calling out her name. Marco appeared before him, calm as always, and noticed the unusual urgency in his voice. She observed that raising his voice like that was unlike him. Procel struggled to contain himself as he questioned why she had never told him about her lifespan. Marco answered simply, reminding him that he had never asked her about it. Procel pressed further, unable to accept it, questioning whether she would truly disappear despite appearing completely healthy. Marco explained that it did not matter how healthy she seemed. Once a demon king reached the end of their lifespan, it ended instantly and without exception. She smiled gently, expressing her relief that her final duty had been serving as his parent. Knowing this allowed her to accept her fate without worry. She then shifted her attention, realizing there was still something she had not yet heard. She had not been told what kind of dungeon he intended to create and wondered if he had gained any ideas during the evening party. Procel fell into thought, and in that moment, everything became clear to him. He finally understood what he wanted to build. The dungeon he would create would be a city. Marco reacted with surprise at the unexpected answer. Procel reflected on how he had previously considered making a dungeon that would not harm his friends, but he realized that idea alone had not been enough. Witnessing the despair of losing important companions and feeling the sadness that came with losing someone precious had left a deep impression on him. Those were feelings he did not want to create. Because of that, he decided his dungeon would be a city. Instead of despair and sadness, it would draw from happiness and hope. If emotions served as the source of a dungeon's power, then he believed those feelings could be used as well. Marco began to laugh, genuinely surprised by the idea. The concept of a city had been completely unexpected. She felt grateful that her final duty had been guiding him. With the time she had left, she intended to watch over him carefully and at her own pace. In that moment, Procel stood as the Demon King of Town Planning. Chapter 9. The Demon King of Creation wished to avoid hurting his friends, and instead of bringing despair, he desired happiness for them. Because of that wish, he chose to create a city rather than a dungeon. However, Procel scratched his head, unable to hide his uncertainty. He struggled to understand what to do next. Marco broke into his thoughts and asked about the progress of the city's creation. Procel let out a tired sigh and questioned whether it even looked like things were going well. He had been borrowing Marco's library and carefully researching, hoping to find guidance. There were many useful pointers explaining how to create a dungeon, but there was nothing that explained how to create a city. He did not even know where such a city should be built. The library itself had been formed by gathering books written by various demon kings. Procel knew he had not yet examined everything inside, but he also believed it would help greatly if Marco and the others assisted him. Kuina reacted with clear reluctance, sulking and showing no desire to help. El looked toward Procel and considered whether the task had anything to do with weapons. Marco then proposed the idea of checking it directly instead. Procel and the others arrived just outside the city and paused to take in their surroundings. Kuina stared ahead in open awe, struck by the massive scale before her. Procel recognized it as a human city and admitted to himself that he had never imagined it would be this large. It was the commercial city of Eklaba, home to a population of around 100,000 people, making it the largest city in the surrounding region. Procel judged that this place would serve as valuable reference material for his goal. With that in mind, they decided to move forward. However, the moment they stepped through the gates, they were forced to retreat almost immediately. Arrows flew toward them, chasing them as they hurried away from the entrance. Procel looked down at his clothes, now filled with arrows, and calmly accepted the outcome. He understood that it was only natural for humans to react that way when someone attempted to bring a demon into their city. Dwarves were recognized as one of the established tribes, but demons were not accepted so easily. Procel recalled that Marco had given them clothes meant for disguise. He concluded that they should wear those and attempt to enter through a different entrance. After changing, Procel looked at Kuina, who now wore human clothing. Despite the disguise, her ears and tail were still visible. He quietly acknowledged to himself that there was nothing they could do about those features. Kuina reacted immediately. She transformed, and her ears and tail disappeared from view. Prosel recognized her effort and praised her success. With their disguises complete, they entered the city once again. As they walked forward, they carefully observed everything around them. The sights inside were even more impressive than what they had seen from outside. Prosel quietly reflected on how amazing it was to witness the city from within. Kuina and Elle, however, showed darkened expressions. Kuina became overwhelmed by the sheer number of humans surrounding them. Elle responded with equal intensity, her thoughts turning toward violence. Both of them felt their impulses rising uncontrollably, driven by instinctive urges triggered by the presence of so many humans. Prosel watched the two of them with concern, realizing that bringing them along might have been a mistake. Their reactions were far more dangerous than he had anticipated. At that moment, a man approached Kuina and Elle, his attention drawn to them. He saw them as charming girls and believed them to be ordinary travelers. He offered to treat them to something nice to eat, confident in his ability to afford it after recently earning money from a dungeon. Prosel stepped forward without hesitation and made it clear that the two girls were part of his group. The man reacted with surprise upon hearing Prosel's claim, quickly twisting it into a crude joke about the girls being accompanied by their father. His mockery did not stop there, as he continued making shameless remarks, openly suggesting improper intentions even in front of him. Suddenly, a woman's voice rang out, shouting in disbelief. The man turned his head toward the sound and saw her approaching. His expression immediately shifted to one of dismissal, and he mocked her appearance without hesitation. At that moment, his friends also noticed her and rushed toward her excitedly, drawn entirely by her figure. Their attention fixated on her chest, and they loudly celebrated their discovery, abandoning all restraint as they moved toward her. Kuina watched the men walk away, anger rising within her. She turned toward Prosel, her thoughts already leaning toward violence. Elle shared the same reaction, calmly preparing her weapon and agreeing with the idea of riddling them completely. Prosel admitted inwardly that he understood their feelings. However, he stopped them before they could act. His attention shifted to something more important. He realized that the men's outfits resembled those of adventurers. They had mentioned earning money in a dungeon, and now that he paid attention, he noticed many others around the city dressed in a similar way. Elle observed the weapons carried by the adventurers and noted their poor quality. She felt disappointed, especially considering the materials used to create them. Prosel acknowledged her observation, recognizing it as the sharp perspective expected from someone of dwarven lineage. As they moved through the city, Prosel purchased food from a nearby vendor and used the opportunity to ask for information. The vendor explained that many of those adventurers were heading toward the dungeon of the Demon King of Time, located north of the city. The vendor expressed surprise that Prosel did not already know this. Prosel thought about the one responsible for reviving those who had died during the evening party. He had never seen that Demon King personally, but he had heard enough. The Demon King of Time was said to possess control over time itself, making him one of the strongest among demon kings. His dungeon was known for its extreme difficulty and near impregnable defenses. However, it also held immense treasure, enough to attract adventurers from all over. Because of that dungeon, adventurers gathered in large numbers, each seeking wealth and glory. Merchants followed them, hoping to profit from their presence. This constant flow of people and trade had caused the city to grow into what it was now. The vendor made it clear that the city's prosperity existed entirely because of the Demon King of Time. Prosel reflected on this information. Since they had already come this close, it made sense to meet him. He called for Elle and Kuina, signaling that they would move north. Their immediate thoughts turned toward confrontation, assuming the possibility of war. Prosel dismissed that notion. He had no intention of acting recklessly against one of the strongest demon kings. Their purpose was not conflict, but creation. As they walked across the open fields beyond the city, Prosel recalled how they had been aided during the evening party. Because of that, he believed it was only proper to go and offer a respectful greeting. Prosel believed there was no disadvantage in building friendships. From his perspective, forming connections would only bring benefits. Kuina reacted with clear dissatisfaction, finding the idea dull and uninteresting. As they continued walking, Prosel observed the surrounding land. The vegetation was sparse, and the soil appeared thin and lacking richness. It was not land that supported much life. Time passed, and night eventually fell over the open fields. Prosel let out a tired sigh, realizing he had not been told that the Demon King of Time's dungeon was located 80 kilometers away. The distance was far greater than he had expected. Kuina immediately complained about the exhausting distance. Elle also showed signs of fatigue, her legs weakened from the long journey and feeling unsteady beneath her. Looking around, Prosel noticed that many adventurers had already set up camps across the area. They had stopped to rest for the night, preparing themselves before continuing toward the dungeon. Prosel decided they should do the same and began preparing to create a tent using his power. Before he could finish, a voice suddenly called out, interrupting him. Prosel turned his attention toward the source and saw a man riding on a wagon. The man addressed him casually, offering goods for sale and questioning his presence near the Demon King of Time's dungeon without proper equipment. Prosel immediately recognized him as a merchant. The merchant introduced himself proudly, explaining that he belonged to Kurtord, the largest and most successful commercial firm in Eklaba. His role was to supply goods to adventurers heading toward the Demon King of Time's dungeon, ensuring they had what they needed before facing its dangers. Prosel repeated the mention of the Time dungeon as his eyes drifted toward a particular item. He noticed a bottle marked with a label indicating 30 years. The merchant quickly explained that the bottle was expensive. In the city, it would have been sold for less than half the current price. However, the added costs of travel, escorts, and transportation had increased its value significantly. Prosel examined the bottle carefully, still questioning the justification. The merchant explained further, making it clear that adventurers had little choice but to buy such supplies. If they were injured inside the dungeon and lacked the means to recover, their lives would be in immediate danger. Returning to the city was not a simple option, as it required traveling 80 kilometers in one direction. Demons could also appear along the way, making the journey even more dangerous. An injured adventurer would struggle to survive such a trip. The merchant made it clear that life carried far more weight than money. When comparing the value of survival against the cost of supplies, the price became insignificant. From that perspective, it was not expensive, but necessary. Prosel quietly judged the merchant's behavior as greedy. The merchant, however, defended his position, insisting that he was simply providing what adventurers needed. He explained that the situation would have been different if another city existed between the dungeon and Eklaba. At those words, Prosel's expression shifted. He understood the meaning behind them. He acknowledged the merchant's explanation and expressed his appreciation before departing. The merchant encouraged him to continue supporting the Kurtord company as they parted ways. The next day, Prosel and his companions arrived at the dungeon of the Demon King of Time, Dantalion. Kuina stood before the massive entrance, immediately overwhelmed by its scale. The structure towered before them, far larger than she had expected. Prosel's attention shifted as he noticed the merchant they had met the previous day. He also saw many others gathered nearby, all sharing the same purpose. Everyone present had come for the dungeon. Prosel prepared himself and moved forward. Kuina responded with excitement, eager to proceed. The moment they entered, they were met with intense chaos. Adventurers and demons were engaged in battle everywhere, filling the dungeon with constant movement and conflict. As they walked through the turmoil, Kuina observed the overwhelming number of people. Elle reacted differently, covering her ears as the noise pressed heavily against her senses. The sound of clashing weapons, movement, and battle echoed endlessly. Prosel compared the density to the city they had visited, realizing that moving through this environment was even more difficult. Kuina then reflected on their original purpose. She remembered that Prosel intended to greet the Demon King of Time, and questioned whether he planned to clear the dungeon normally in order to reach him. Prosel paused, placing a hand against his face as he realized he had not considered that problem at all. Elle then recalled that the dungeon was known to contain over 100 floors. Reaching the bottom through ordinary means would be extremely difficult. At that moment, everything suddenly stopped. Prosel noticed that both adventurers and demons had frozen completely in place. None of them moved. The scene became unnaturally still, as if time itself had been halted. Before he could fully process what was happening, the ground trembled beneath them. In an instant, their surroundings changed, and they found themselves transported elsewhere. Prosel looked around, confused by the sudden shift. He did not know when or how they had been moved. Then, the presence of another made itself known. The Demon King of Time revealed that Marco had informed him that Prosel would likely come seeking him. Because of that, he had invited Prosel directly while time remained stopped. Prosel realized who stood before him. The one before him was the Demon King of Time, Dantalion. Chapter 10. Prosel realized that the person before him was one of the strongest demon kings, the demon king of time, Dantalion. Dantalion stated that he remembered Prosel well, recognizing him as the new demon king who had put on a show at the evening party. He questioned what brought Prosel here, noting that Prosel did not appear hostile. Prosel explained that he had been nearby and thought it would be proper to greet him and express his gratitude for the evening party. Dantalion laughed, finding it agreeable, and expressed that he did not dislike polite youngsters. Dantalion then brought up the evening party again, explaining that after the party, new demon kings like Prosel had officially been granted permission by the creator to construct dungeons and participate in wars, or more accurately, that such duties had been imposed upon them. He asked whether Prosel, who had been the center of attention, had already decided on the type and location of his dungeon. Kuina answered that they had been searching for a suitable place. However, Prosel corrected her, stating that he had already decided where he would build his dungeon. Kuina reacted with surprise, questioning whether he truly had. Prosel declared that his dungeon would be located between the commercial city of Eklaba and the dungeon belonging to Dantalion, the demon king of time. Dantalion noted that the adventurers from Eklaba were his primary customers, making Eklaba effectively his territory. He questioned the meaning behind Prosel's decision to construct a dungeon along that road. In the next instant, Dantalion appeared behind Prosel, having stopped time and moved without warning. Kuina and El reacted immediately, preparing to fight as they realized he had frozen time and repositioned himself behind them. Prosel quickly ordered El and Kuina to stop. He glanced back and clarified that it was a misunderstanding, explaining that he had no intention of harming Dantalion's profits. He revealed that the dungeon he planned to create would be a city. Dantalion laughed and released Prosel, revealing that he had only been joking. He explained that Marco had contacted him beforehand. Prosel questioned this, realizing that Marco had informed Dantalion. He learned that he and Marco were from the same year, and that she had predicted someone as straightforward as Prosel would likely come to greet him. Prosel reflected that she had understood his character completely. Dantalion returned to his throne and looked down at Prosel, granting him permission to proceed as he wished. He acknowledged that if the dungeon was to be a city, there would be no dispute over adventurers. Prosel expressed his gratitude, though his voice carried slight tension. However, Dantalion added that there would be compensation, since Prosel was attempting to earn profit within his territory. He declared that the compensation would be Prosel's creation medal and asked whether he agreed to that condition. Prosel was visibly shocked. Dantalion continued, explaining that a medal with such a unique characteristic, one that served as a key to creating S-ranked demons, was extremely interesting. Prosel recalled his earlier conversation with Marco, remembering how she had warned him that he had drawn significant attention during the evening party. She had cautioned him that many would seek to uncover the secrets behind his metal and weapons, and that he needed to remain careful. At that moment, Prosel understood that this was exactly what Marco had meant. Dantalion stated that if Prosel did not agree, then there was little else to discuss, and he would simply have to find another location. He pressed Prosel to decide what he would do. After weighing his options, Prosel stated that he understood and agreed to give the creation medal to Dantalion. El looked at him in surprise, questioning his decision. Prosel affirmed his choice, recognizing that it would not be wise to create conflict at this stage. He also reasoned that his city would ultimately benefit Dantalion as well, and if Dantalion recognized that, there was even a possibility of becoming allies. Kuina raised her concern, wondering whether this decision was dangerous. Prosel acknowledged that it carried risk, but he also understood the rules governing demon kings. Senior demon kings were forbidden from taking action against new demon kings until the newcomers had officially matured. Furthermore, since Dantalion was from the same year as Marco, by the time Prosel reached official maturity, Dantalion's lifespan would have progressed to a point that significantly reduced the likelihood of direct opposition between them. This meant that the chances of them becoming enemies were relatively low. El accepted his reasoning. Kuina expressed admiration for Prosel, recognizing the careful thought behind his decision. Prosel then looked at Dantalion and acknowledged that they had reached an agreement, but questioned why Dantalion had acted aggressively earlier if Marco had already contacted him beforehand. Dantalion answered plainly, revealing that the reason was simple frustration. Prosel was left confused and reacted with surprise. Dantalion suddenly rushed in front of him, his composure gone as he spoke with intensity. He fixated on the fact that Marco was Prosel's parent, which meant Prosel lived beside her constantly under the same roof. The thought filled him with envy, as he imagined Marco being there from morning until night, making every day feel like a perfect paradise. His overwhelming energy caused Prosel to panic and he instinctively backed away, feeling unsettled by the sudden shift in behavior. He began to wonder if Dantalion had feelings for Marco. Dantalion admitted that he had not even been allowed to hold her hand, his frustration clear. He then nervously questioned whether Prosel and Marco shared a deeper relationship. Prosel immediately denied it, firmly clarifying that they were not in that kind of relationship. Hearing this, Dantalion released a deep sigh of relief. He explained that when he had received Marco's message, she had spoken about Prosel with such happiness that it had stirred his emotions. Prosel thought to himself that it would be best not to mention the times he had seen Marco casually walking around naked, realizing that if Dantalion ever learned that, his life would be in danger. He then stated that he could tell Marco about what had happened today in a positive way, even though he did not particularly want to involve himself further. Dantalion reacted with excitement upon hearing this. In his enthusiasm, he declared that he would give Prosel his time medal and also a water medal, stating that it would be unfair if Prosel only possessed the create medal. Prosel was surprised and questioned this, reminding Dantalion that the creation medal had been given as compensation for building the city. Dantalion clarified that the additional medals were simply gifts, offered to support him as a senior demon king with a kind heart. He then waved them off warmly, asking Prosel to greet Marco on his behalf. As Prosel prepared to leave, he reflected on how unexpected the outcome had been. Not only had he received permission to build his city, but he had also gained what could be considered an ally, though Dantalion's personality remained difficult to fully understand. Just before Prosel could depart, Dantalion called out again and asked one final question. He referred to Prosel's earlier statement about building a city between his dungeon and Eklaba, and questioned whether Prosel was truly certain about constructing a city in that specific location. Prosel and his contracted demons stood before the swamp, staring at the murky landscape spread out in front of them. As he stepped forward toward one of the puddles, his footing gave way, and he fell into the soft, unstable ground. Kuina immediately shouted in alarm as she rushed toward him. Prosel realized that when they had passed through the area the previous day, the darkness had concealed the truth. Now that he could see clearly, it was obvious that the entire region was covered in poisonous swamps. It was immediately apparent that building a city in such a place would be extremely difficult. He considered the nature of dungeon creation, knowing that constructing a dungeon involved overriding a designated area. That process alone would not be enough. A city, unlike a dungeon, would always be influenced by the surrounding environment. No matter how many times he overwrote sections of land, it would be meaningless if the fundamental environment itself remained unsuitable. This explained why nothing had been built along this road despite the heavy traffic that passed through it. El asked what he intended to do next, questioning whether he would search for a different location. Prosel refused to abandon the idea so easily. He expressed that, if possible, he wanted to build the city here. He recalled the distance between Eklaba and the dungeon, remembering how vast the gap was. If a city were established at the midpoint between the two, it would serve an essential role. Inns for adventurers traveling toward the dungeon would naturally thrive, but beyond that, it would function as a supply base where exhausted adventurers could rest and recover. It would also attract travelers and merchants, becoming a strategic foothold. He thought about the burden adventurers faced, having to carry treasures over a distance of 80 kilometers after leaving the dungeon. A city in this location would ease that burden significantly. It could grow into a marketplace where those treasures could be traded, creating economic activity and encouraging further development. In time, he even envisioned selling specialty products unique to the city. However, he pushed those future plans aside for the moment. He remembered the merchant they had met the previous day, who had spoken about how beneficial it would be if a city existed in this area. That memory reinforced his belief that this was the correct place to build it. Prosel focused his thoughts, frustrated that they had encountered such a major obstacle at the very first step. If the issue were limited to geology, he could address it using his authority over Earth. However, the problems extended beyond the ground itself. The conditions of the air and the water were also factors, and those were not as simple to correct. Kuina suggested that if water was the problem, they could use the water medal they had just received from the Demon King of Time. Prosel acknowledged that he had already considered that option. However, he explained that the issue extended beyond the water. The air itself was polluted, and the vegetation growing naturally in the swamp was also part of the problem. What they needed was something more comprehensive, something capable of administering nature as a whole. As he thought about this, a small demon suddenly appeared, flapping its wings near his head. Kuina reacted with surprise, questioning what the creature was. Procel recognized it immediately as a communication demon sent by Strauss. He explained that she had mentioned she would write a paper, and now a letter was attached. He began reading the contents. The letter asked how things had been since the evening party and whether he was doing well. Strauss explained that she had successfully created a new demon using the metal he had given her. She also mentioned that Asteros had been troubled over concerns about savings and resources. She questioned whether Procel had already created any demons using the metal she had given him and warned him not to waste it. Procel handed the letter to Kuina as realization struck him. He understood that he could use the wind metal he had received from Strauss. Kuina continued reading and noticed a postscript. It explained that other new demon kings had begun to feel threatened by Procel's strength during the evening party and were now forming alliances. Strauss herself had received an invitation to join them, and she warned that Procel needed to remain cautious. With his decision made, Procel began the synthesis. He combined create, wind, and imitate human. As he focused, he realized that wind alone would not be enough. He needed something greater, something tied more deeply to nature itself. He envisioned a demon with power connected to the stars. He altered the synthesis, commanding the create attribute to change into star, and called for the new being to be born. An ancient elf appeared before them. This demon specialized in nature, possessing abilities suited to solving the environmental problems before them. However, the moment the ancient elf saw Kuina and El, her attention shifted completely. She rushed toward them and embraced them tightly, overwhelmed by their presence. She became fixated on their appearance, admiring their features and expressing delight in their cuteness. Procel attempted to address her, apologizing for the sudden summoning and trying to explain the situation, but she ignored him entirely, her attention fully occupied with Kuina and El. She continued fussing over them, even reaching out with fascination toward El's fluffy features. Kuina and El both reacted with visible unease. Procel let out a quiet sigh, recognizing that he had once again created a unique demon with an unusual personality. He called out to the ancient elf, asking whether she would listen to him. She reassured him that she understood and acknowledged him as her master. He immediately instructed her to wipe the drool from her mouth, restoring some order to the situation. The ancient elf then turned her attention to the task at hand. She told El that they would work together to resolve the problem at once. El accepted the instruction, ready to fulfill her master's will. Together, they cast their abilities, purify and improve. The effects spread across the land, transforming the poisonous swamp. The corrupted water cleared, the polluted air refreshed, and the decayed vegetation was replaced. The once toxic swamp was converted into a vast, beautiful field. Kuina and Procel stared at the transformed landscape in astonishment. The change had happened instantly, far beyond what Procel had expected. In that moment, he understood that the foundation for his city was finally ready. Chapter 11. Inside Marco's dungeon, Marco informed Procel that she had already heard from Dantalion. Procel turned his attention to her. She revealed that he was making a city near Dantalion's dungeon, and her surprise came from the fact that he had not caused any trouble. In truth, the situation had given her chills. Marco then stated that the location was perfect for building the best city. The idea of a city lingered in her thoughts. At first, she had believed it was nothing more than a joke, but seeing it progress properly brought her relief. Procel explained that he had only just decided on the location. Marco then asked if he was leaving her dungeon that very day. He confirmed that he was, and that Kuina and El were also helping him. He reflected that city building was not so different from managing a demon king's dungeon, meaning the responsibilities were largely the same as those of a normal dungeon. After the evening party, the creator had given each of the new demon kings a crystal. This crystal had to be placed in the deepest part of their dungeon. Once the crystal was set, it could no longer be moved. That meant once a demon king began building their dungeon, they would be bound to that location. Leaving it unattended would be dangerous, since there was no guarantee that no one would attack while they were away. This risk was especially high for him, since he had drawn attention to himself during the evening party. Still, he believed that such a threat could be avoided if he focused on creating and developing a dungeon with strong defenses. Marco then remarked that it was his time to leave the nest as well. She had already known this moment would come, yet it would still feel lonely. Her attention shifted to the thing behind Procel, and she asked if it belonged to Dantalion. He confirmed that it had been included in the gift set he received. She wondered if he had realized what it was. Procel concluded that it was most likely for surveillance, since he was building a dungeon within Dantalion's territory. He understood that such caution was only natural. His gaze rested on the demon bird, and he allowed it to continue its task. At the same time, he believed it could serve as a way to show Dantalion that he was not an enemy. Even so, he remained careful, keeping certain matters hidden that he wished to remain secret. Marco smiled, deciding that it was fine. She believed it would also be useful for teleportation. Since he was already planning such things, she thought it would be good for him to create a teleportation circle in her dungeon as well. That way, it would be much easier for him to visit. The idea that he could even come every day if he wished made the thought feel lighter. Prosel laughed at that, realizing that if he did so, there would be no meaning in him leaving at all. Kuina's voice called out to him, informing him that everything had been prepared. El added that all the golems that had been mining the dungeon had also been gathered. Prosel responded that he would be there soon. Marco acknowledged it and caught his gaze. Under normal circumstances, she would have wanted to give him a present before his departure. However, demon kings who held the parent role were restricted in what they could give, and she felt regret over that limitation. Prosel set down his box, having been curious about what she intended to say. He had already received many things from Marco. His hand began to glow as he used Create. In the next moment, a necklace appeared around Marco's neck. The jewel resting there shined with a beauty she had never seen before. It was a diamond, a gem said to emit endless glimmers. The meaning behind it carried his resolve, reflecting that their bond would not change and that he would never forget what she had done for him, just like the diamond itself. Marco touched the necklace, deeply moved. It felt unfair to her that such feelings rose to the surface, as it had been over a century since she had last cried. Prosel smiled, feeling relieved that she liked it. Marco leaned closer, deciding that since she could not give him something physical, she had thought of the perfect present. Before he could fully understand her meaning, Marco pressed her lips against his. She pulled back with a smile, while Prosel remained in disbelief. Her gaze lingered on him as if waiting for a response. He struggled to grasp her intention, while at the same time sensing a strong wave of jealousy directed toward him. Elsewhere, Dantalion watched with clenched teeth. Marco then pushed Prosel gently onto the bed, her expression unchanged as she considered the situation further, as if asking whether he wished for it to continue. Prosel's face flushed, caught completely off guard, while Marco simply continued to smile. Kuina's voice suddenly called out to him. Prosel's face turned red, and he quickly pushed Marco away. Though he felt grateful for her invitation, he understood that he had to refuse, as it was already time for him to leave. Marco accepted his decision, recognizing that it would not be right to keep the others waiting any longer. Prosel called out to Marco, then picked up his luggage. He expressed his intention to invite her once his city had properly developed. Marco responded with a smile, accepting his promise and urging him to go. Outside, Kuina complained about how slow he was. Prosel apologized as he approached them. Behind him, Marco remained alone, her fingers resting on the diamond necklace. The jewel continued to shine endlessly. The meaning behind it lingered heavily within her thoughts. For someone who would soon disappear from her side, giving her something that shined forever felt almost cruel in its gentleness. Later, Prosel and the demons gathered at the location of the future city. He held the crystal firmly, preparing for the first step of construction. The crystal began to glow as he declared that this place would become his dungeon. Magic flowed outward from it, spreading across the land. Kuina watched the crystal in amazement. Prosel explained that now that the area had been designated as his dungeon within this world, the process would continue just like it had during the evening party. He began shaping the dungeon using magic, constructing a one-level structure with a 3-floor plan. He understood that creating anything beyond that would require adding more levels later. He decided that the first floor would serve as the city itself. Since El and the ancient elf had already purified the land and air, he could safely set the environment as flat land. He expanded the size outward until it stretched 10 kilometers in every direction. The second floor and the floors beyond would be used for gathering resources needed to develop the city, as well as for living spaces. His attention shifted briefly to their luggage, reminding himself that they would also need to unpack their belongings. He then continued planning the resources. Since water sources and food production could already be handled on the first floor, the next priority was to create a mine. Kuina and El encouraged him with enthusiasm, believing in his ability. In response, a massive mountain rose beside them, formed through the power of the crystal. With that, the basic foundation was complete. However, he understood the true challenge still remained. While the crystal could create a dungeon filled with danger and complexity, it could not build houses or maintain infrastructure. that responsibility rested entirely on them. He turned to Kuina and El, seeking their help in building the city itself. Kuina eagerly agreed without hesitation. With everything decided, Prosul resolved that they would begin at once. The construction of their city had officially begun. Chapter 12. Only a few moments after leaving Marco's dungeon, they had already begun working tirelessly on building the city. The labor weighed on them, and Prosul eventually let out a sigh, deciding that it was time for lunch. Kuina lifted her shovel, exhausted from the effort. El observed the situation and realized that they did not have nearly enough people to handle the work. Kuina quickly agreed with that conclusion. Prosul found this surprising, since they already had the golems and the demons he had summoned to help. El then directed his attention toward the reality in front of them, leading him to reconsider. Both El and Prosul looked across the vast field of grass that stretched endlessly before them. Faced with the sheer scale, he acknowledged the truth. The city he intended to build was located on the first floor of the first level, spanning 10 kilometers in every direction, which was the maximum size he could designate. Completing something of that magnitude with their current numbers was impossible. Because of that, he had already summoned as many demons as he could manage. For Kuina, he had created a yuko. For El, he had created a dwarf smith. For the ancient elf, he had created a high elf. He had also created 2 compatible demons for each of them, carefully choosing those who would best support their roles. Even with those additions, it still was not enough. The situation remained far from sufficient. Worse still, he had no dungeon points left to create more demons. If this had been a normal dungeon, he would have been able to create whatever he needed as long as he had dungeon points available. However, this was a city rather than a traditional dungeon, making it an exception. Everything had to be built through their own effort. The weight of that reality made it far more difficult than he had originally expected. Even so, he still had ideas to address the manpower problem. His thoughts turned to the skeleton army he had created before. Those skeletons had been set aside because they were difficult to control. Simply having more numbers would not necessarily solve the problem. If anything, their lack of coordination would only slow progress instead of helping it. He lowered himself to the ground and began thinking carefully. He believed he still had some metals left. After checking, he realized there were only 2 remaining, and both of them were imitations. He knew he could synthesize them, but doing so would only result in 1 additional metal, which did not seem particularly meaningful. Then his attention caught on one of them. It was a death imitation metal. The memory surfaced clearly in his mind. He had obtained it during the evening party, just before his battle with Strauss, when he had traded for it. The other metal in his possession was a human imitation metal. He decided it was worth attempting. By combining something that symbolized immortality, like death, with something that symbolized intelligence, like human, there was a possibility of creating a demon capable of commanding the skeletons. With that thought, he proceeded to synthesize the death and human imitation metals. Almost immediately, something felt wrong. He realized he could not fully grasp or control the demon that was beginning to emerge. The reason became clear to him. Until now, he had been able to create and control demons freely because of his creation metal. This time was different. Without that direct control, the outcome was uncertain. He had no way of knowing what kind of demon would appear. Worse still, the human aspect introduced unpredictability, increasing the chance of creating something he could not manage. His mind briefly imagined skeleton demons with rebellious, unruly behavior. If such a situation occurred, the problem would go far beyond city building. A sudden gust of air forced him backward. Before him, dark mist gathered and thickened, enveloping the forming figure. Slowly, a skeleton emerged from within the darkness, wearing a crown and a dark robe. Prosul observed carefully, hoping at the very least that communication would be possible. He introduced himself as the Demon King of Creation, Prosul. The skeleton responded with movement, turning its face toward him. The being expressed its respect and identified itself as White, a duke of the underworld. Relief settled over Prosul. The presence before him was not only manageable, but far better than expected. Even though White was considered low rank, Prosul could clearly sense genuine intelligence. He immediately asked whether White could understand the skeletons and command them to assist with building the city. White confirmed that he could. As an undead, he possessed the ability to communicate with low-level undead and even share their memories. To demonstrate, White flicked his bony fingers. At once, the skeleton's eyes began to glow, and they quickly assembled themselves into formation. What followed was something Prosul had never anticipated. The skeletons began moving in coordinated, acrobatic motions, performing with unexpected precision. He watched in astonishment at the display unfolding before him. In the middle of this, White suddenly focused his attention elsewhere. His gaze settled upon one of the skeletons, reacting with clear admiration. The skeleton woman responded with visible pleasure. White gently took her hand, expressing approval toward her form and presence, and reacted positively to her name when it was revealed. Procel observed the exchange in disbelief, realizing that the skeleton in question was female. White then returned his attention to Procel. He recalled that Procel had mentioned something earlier about building a city. Procel confirmed his intention. Rather than creating a dungeon meant for destruction, he was planning to build a city where people could live peacefully and happily. It was different from the usual role expected of demons. White stood silently, staring at him. The pause caused Procel to grow uneasy, prompting him to look toward White with concern. White reflected on the nature of demons. Unlike normal living beings, demons were not born as helpless infants. From the moment of their creation, they emerged fully formed, as if pulled directly from the pages of a book. From the very beginning, they existed as pawns of the dungeon and the demon king, prepared to kill humans without hesitation. Hearing this, Procel understood something he had not fully realized before. It explained why Kuina and El had displayed bloodlust even within the city. Their nature had been shaped from the moment they came into existence. White continued, recalling his own countless rebirths under different demon kings. Through those endless cycles, he had come to experience loneliness. By reading through the memories of the undead, he had come to understand that existence was nothing more than an unending repetition. Yet Procel had treated them differently. Instead of using them as disposable tools, he had left them as they were. To White, that alone reflected a kind nature. Procel averted his gaze slightly, unable to admit that his actions had come from uncertainty rather than kindness. White's expression brightened with enthusiasm at the thought of city building. He spread his arms wide, recognizing the meaning behind it. After countless battles and endless servitude, this place represented something they had never truly possessed before, a safe place to exist. White lowered himself to one knee before Procel, pledging his loyalty once again. This loyalty was not given merely because Procel was a demon king, but because White had come to recognize him as a true king worthy of allegiance. Procel accepted his resolve. Nearby, El observed the scene quietly, while Kuina watched with unease still visible in her eyes. White declared his determination to serve fully, dedicating himself completely to the task ahead. Procel dismissed the dramatic tone, finding no humor in such words. From that point onward, the pace of the city's development increased dramatically with the addition of White and the skeleton army. Their usefulness extended far beyond simple labor. White himself began studying architecture and city building, teaching himself using books obtained from dwarves and other sources. He also established communication with the other demons who had previously been left without direction, connecting everyone and greatly improving their coordination and efficiency. His presence became comparable to that of a second leader. During the construction, one of the golems struck the ground, breaking through the surface. Suddenly, water burst upward from beneath the earth. Kuina reacted with excitement, recognizing it as an onsen. The discovery brought an unexpected advantage to the city, creating a valuable feature that could attract others. Procel realized that such a place would need to be separated properly for different uses. Nearby, White covered his eyes, overcome by his own reaction as he thought of Suxan. Procel and his companions looked upon the results of their efforts. After all the work they had endured, the city had finally reached its final stage of preparation. Chapter 13. The city was, for the most part, complete. Kuina reacted with excitement, celebrating that all the buildings had finally been finished. El signaled approval, confirming that the infrastructure was also in perfect condition. The ancient elf gave her report, stating that the housing had been completed and that the fields had been blessed by the elves. With everything in place, the city was now properly prepared for applicants to begin moving in. White reflected that because of all the effort they had poured into it, their feelings toward the city had grown much stronger. Procel agreed, noting that the only thing left was to call over some humans. White wondered if humans would actually come, since during the entire time they had been building the city, none had even looked in their direction. Procel understood the reason clearly. The camouflage had prevented humans from seeing anything except the entrance. Once they removed the camouflage at the same time as opening the city, it would finally become visible, and people would notice and come. Everyone would be able to see it. Since that day marked the anniversary of the city's completion and they were already gathered there, Procel decided they would have lunch beneath the tree on the hill. In truth, when they had first begun building the city, they had planted a tree on that hilltop overlooking everything below. It was the apple tree of beginnings. On the very first day of construction, Procel had used creation to make an apple tree, only to discover that apples did not exist in that world. Because of that discovery, he had started cultivating them himself. That tree had been the very first one he planted. He watched Kuina closely as she leaned toward the fruit and smelled it, her curiosity clear. The ancient elf observed it as well, noting that she had never seen such a fruit before. Together with the onsen, this apple tree would become one of the defining features and selling points of the city. The ancient elf felt satisfied, knowing she had blessed it with all her strength. El reported that the potatoes were also ready. At that moment, an apple fell from the tree, and Procel reached out and caught it. Without hesitation, he took a bite. Kuina watched him with focused curiosity. The taste filled him immediately. The apple was juicy and sweet, and as he ate it, he felt his fatigue fading away. Strength began to return to him, and his energy swelled from within. In that moment, he clearly understood that this was the result of the ancient elf's blessing. Procel picked another apple and offered it to Kuina. She accepted it and took a bite, and at once her eyes began to shine with wonder. The sweetness and richness of the fruit left a deep impression on her. Without hesitation, Kuina then offered her apple to El. El accepted it and bit into it as well, and she too was struck by how remarkable it tasted. The flavor settled firmly into Kuina's memory, something she knew she would never forget. Procel shared the same feeling, knowing that the experience would remain with him just as strongly. In that moment his confidence became clear. He believed firmly that this city would succeed. With renewed energy, everyone moved to complete their final tasks. The preparations had reached their end, and the opening of the city was set for the following day. Kuina reacted with excitement, filled with anticipation. El then turned her attention to Procel, wondering if he had already decided on a name for the city. Procel held a quiet smile, revealing that he had already chosen it. The city would be called the City of Hopes and Smiles, Avalon. The next morning, far from the city, an adventurer suddenly screamed before collapsing dramatically onto the ground. His strength had failed him, and he could go no farther. The others continued moving, unable to stop. One man urged him to endure and try to keep walking. A woman reflected on their situation, realizing that they had completely underestimated Dantalion's power. Frustration lingered as the image of that lizard remained in their minds, its foolish appearance hiding its overwhelming strength. The woman insisted that complaints could wait. The witch agreed, recognizing the seriousness of their condition. At their current pace, their food would run out long before they reached Eklaba. Their situation was growing more desperate, and what they needed most was a place to rest. Then, something unusual caught their attention. There was a city ahead. It stood where there should have been nothing. Inside the store, Kuina cried out in frustration, overwhelmed by the amount of work in front of her. The sheer volume of items waiting to be sorted was far beyond what she could handle alone, and her anger turned toward Procel for leaving her with such responsibility. Her emotions spilled over as she struggled to keep up. The adventurers who had entered the store paused and watched the scene unfold. Kuina, together with Kitsune, was working as part of the store's staff. The sight of a child handling such duties caused one adventurer to question her role, noticing her nervousness and wondering if she was truly capable of managing the task. The witch, observing the situation, recognized that despite the chaos, the store itself was thriving. Nearby, a demon cashier calmly assisted a customer, offering potatoes as part of the order. The adventurer watched closely, impressed by how precisely the child followed the procedures, responding exactly as if guided by a manual. Elsewhere in the city, Procel walked through the streets, observing everything around him. Only half a day had passed since the city had opened, yet the number of visitors had already exceeded expectations. This confirmed that they had chosen the right location. He considered the feedback coming from the adventurers. He trusted in the quality of what they offered, and the demons were carrying out their duties exactly as instructed in the manual. Still, it was clear they were somewhat short on staff. His attention was drawn to a voice filled with amazement. An adventurer stood nearby, deeply impressed by what he had just experienced. The water alone had surprised him, its quality far beyond anything he had expected. The witch, still affected by their recent exhaustion, shared in the surprise, recognizing how refreshing it was. Another adventurer examined a fruit, astonished by its taste and its effect. As he ate it, his fatigue faded, leaving him refreshed. A woman nearby experienced the same wonder with the bread, noticing its remarkable flavor and the natural sweetness of the flour. It surpassed any bread she had ever eaten before. Another adventurer admired a sword he had purchased in the city. Despite being made of mithril, it had cost only 2 gold coins. Its surface shone brilliantly, far exceeding the quality of the blunt steel sword he had previously used, which had cost twice as much. Attention then turned to an even more extraordinary weapon displayed in front of the store. Though it was not for sale, its craftsmanship was beyond comparison, something that could only be described as divine. It was said that a dwarf living in the city had forged it. One of the adventurers recalled that there had been a workshop in the city capable of repairing equipment and even creating custom-made items upon request. The group quietly discussed it among themselves, trying to understand what kind of place this was. The presence of a dwarf suggested one possibility, yet the store had been staffed by humans. They had also seen an elf. The mixture of races left them uncertain about the true nature of the city. Prosel stepped forward and interrupted their thoughts, revealing that this was a city he had built for the coexistence of humans and demi-humans. He carried a calm smile as he expressed his gratitude for their decision to come to his city. He introduced himself as Prosel, the one who stood as the head of the city. The adventurers remained silent, still trying to grasp what was happening. Prosel continued, acknowledging that it had been improper to overhear their conversation, yet he had done so unintentionally. He recognized them as adventurers capable of spreading word of what they had seen. With that in mind, he decided it would be worthwhile to conduct some business. He invited them to follow him, offering to personally show them around the town. They soon arrived at another establishment. Prosel presented it as the city's inn. One of the women immediately admired its beauty, struck by its elegant appearance. One of the men studied its structure closely, noticing unfamiliar design elements that still reflected masterful craftsmanship. White stood waiting inside, his face covered, and welcomed them as the master of the inn. The adventurers were caught off guard by his imposing size. White calmly explained the services the inn provided. It offered both private rooms and large shared rooms. The private rooms could accommodate up to 4 people and were available for 2 silver coins. The larger rooms were offered at a rate of 1 silver coin per person. Regardless of the choice, guests could also rent a warm blanket for additional comfort. Both options were strictly for lodging, without meals included. The adventurers were surprised by how inexpensive it was. White continued, explaining that in place of meals, the inn provided access to a well located in the inner garden, available for free use. In addition, the inn also offered access to an onsen. The mention of the onsen immediately drew strong reactions from the 2 women, who recognized its significance. The 2 men, unfamiliar with the term, looked to them for understanding. The explanation was simple. It was a place for bathing in hot water. The thought of bathing freely in warm water carried a strong appeal, offering a level of comfort that felt almost unreal. One of the women expressed how much she liked the city. The idea of returning to Eklaba no longer felt as certain to her, and she began considering the possibility of using this place as their base instead. The man beside her calmed her, even though he himself recognized the city's appeal. Still, he understood the reality of their situation. If they did not return to Eklaba, the stock they currently carried would not serve its intended purpose. Prosel observed their exchange and reflected on what he had just heard. He realized that for adventurers to remain in the city for longer periods, there needed to be a way for them to earn money quickly. He had considered the idea of people moving into the city, but he had not thought far enough about how they would sustain themselves once they arrived. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted as Kuina ran toward him in distress. She collapsed onto the floor, her condition even worse than when they had faced the Emerald Dragon. Her strength was nearly gone from exhaustion. She struggled to convey that there were far too many customers, and they could no longer keep up even with L's manual-guided responses. The manual itself had already reached its limit. The only solution she saw was the creation of more demon subordinates. Prosel quickly tried to calm her, aware that such statements could reveal his identity as a demon king if overheard. The witch nearby noticed the exchange and paid close attention. Prosel thought carefully about their situation. They were already in difficulty. He had not yet accumulated enough DP to create additional demons. The skeletons working in the bread workshop beneath the city could not be brought out, as their appearance would shock the people too greatly. That was precisely why they remained hidden in the basement, carrying out their work away from human eyes. At that moment, the woman who had admired the city earlier proposed a simple solution. If the city lacked enough workers, they could hire people instead. The witch reacted with surprise, caught off guard by the suggestion. She had hoped to rest for at least one day after everything they had endured. She also felt that the proposal was somewhat forward, directing her frustration toward Rixa. Rixa, however, remained firm in her reasoning. Without money, they had no choice but to find a way to earn it. Prosel looked at the adventurers as the idea formed clearly in his mind. A part-time job. It was something he had completely overlooked until now. He quickly decided on the terms and offered them payment of 6 silver coins per day. The witch was visibly surprised by the amount. The other woman immediately accepted without hesitation. With that, their need to return to Eklaba disappeared. The two adventurers left with renewed energy, ready to begin working. Prosel watched them go, recognizing that this solution would help stabilize the situation for the time being. He then turned his attention to White, asking about the manpower on his side. White understood the question to be about the bread workshop. He reported that operations there were proceeding smoothly. Among all their facilities, it had the strongest numbers and was functioning efficiently. He then asked about the reviews their bread had been receiving. Prosel confirmed that the response had been superb. White reacted with quiet pride, honored by the praise. Prosel reflected on their progress. The city's opening had gone better than he had expected, and for the moment, there was some relief. However, he knew they could not allow themselves to relax. As rumors spread, more adventurers would inevitably arrive in the coming weeks. When that happened, the strain on the city would increase, and disorder would follow if they were unprepared. They needed to increase both part-time workers and demon subordinates as quickly as possible. Even as he thought through these measures, he realized that it would not be enough in the long run. Maintaining their current level of service quality would become increasingly difficult. They needed another solution. His thoughts turned toward a more ambitious possibility. Ideally, he wanted someone experienced in the service industry. Someone capable of managing operations and helping maintain peace and order within the city. A professional he could trust. If they could bring a skilled merchant to their side, it would strengthen the city greatly. At that moment, a long-haired merchant entered the city. He had come after hearing the rumors of a city that had appeared overnight. As he stepped inside, he observed the surroundings carefully. The city was already thriving, yet he intended to conduct a proper inspection for himself. Within the Demon King Prosel's city of Avalon, the shops were filled with noise as adventurers crowded in and overwhelmed the demon workers. Orders were thrown around from every direction, with demands for weapons and food piling up all at once. Supplies quickly ran out, adding to the confusion. Kuina could no longer hold back her frustration, while Yuko reacted with clear fear. The female adventurers stepped in and began restoring order, forcing everyone into a single line. They reprimanded the crowd, reminding them not to frighten children. Kuina observed as one of the women continued scolding another customer for trying to cut ahead, noting that the humans hired there were actually quite capable. Elle added that those same humans also helped out in the workshop. Kuina found that surprising, and Elle explained that dwarves, with their strong craftsman nature, often struggled with customer interactions, so the extra help made a difference. At one point, an adventurer complained about having to pay for such services, but a dwarf smith working alongside Elle responded firmly that anyone dissatisfied was free to leave. Before the situation could worsen, the humans stepped in again and calmed everything down. Kuina reacted quietly to the scene. Elle then shifted attention to Kina, wondering if her transformation was holding up, since she had been instructed to stay in human form within the city. Kuina struggled with it, feeling constrained and uncomfortable, and assumed there was no immediate danger of being discovered. However, a woman suddenly appeared and casually asked about the shop's remaining stock. Kuina panicked at the unexpected encounter, while Elle remained unfazed. As Kuina attempted to transform, Elle stopped her, recognizing it was already too late. The woman carefully observed them and realized the truth. Kuina and Elle could only watch as the realization settled. The woman then openly pointed out that the shop workers were actually fox demi-humans. The surrounding adventurers reacted with surprise, questioning whether they were demi-humans or perhaps even demons based on their presence. A witch among them intervened, urging everyone to lower their weapons. She explained that there was no threat, pointing out how diligently they had been working. She also remarked on how a fox demi-human dressed in frilly clothing had a certain charm. That observation shifted the mood, and the adventurers began reacting with excitement and curiosity rather than fear. The woman then explained her reasoning, noting that it seemed unfair that dwarves and elves could appear as they were while these two had to hide. She wondered if her interference had caused trouble. Kuina denied that, admitting it actually helped. The woman responded with satisfaction, clearly pleased with the outcome. Elle agreed with the situation, noting that in a city where humans and demons coexisted, this kind of openness worked better. Kuina reflected on her own thoughts, realizing she had always viewed humans simply as dungeon prey, but was now beginning to see them differently. The woman picked up on that shift, recognizing it as a form of praise. Kuina acknowledged it in her own way, accepting that her perspective had changed. The woman smiled, then set her sights on the decorated sword, declaring that she wanted it as a reward. Kuina's eyes widened at once, while Elle's narrowed, recognizing how bold and unreasonable the request was. Elle continued to refuse firmly, making it clear that the sword was not for sale. It was the result of her finest work, something she had devoted herself to mastering, almost like a perfected reflection of her craft. The woman casually pointed out that the sword would draw in customers, and Elle reacted sharply, frustrated that such a thought had been spoken aloud. The attempt to brush it off failed, and irritation lingered. The woman continued reasoning that with such a sword, clearing dungeons would become easy, and even selling it would provide enough wealth to live freely for a lifetime. Elle judged her attitude, finding it shameless that she would ask for something so valuable as if it were a simple reward. Yuko stepped in, urging everyone to stop treating the situation lightly. Kuina, however, decided that it was acceptable for things to go this far, especially with this human present. At that moment, a man called out loudly, announcing that they were ready for another adventure and that it was time to challenge Dantalion's tower again. The woman quickly removed her apron, deciding they should leave immediately. Kuina reacted in surprise at the sudden decision, concerned about them leaving so abruptly. The woman reassured her that it was fine, since the shop's stock had already been cleared out. The witch added that customers over the past few days had been buying in bulk, emptying supplies quickly. They would return in a few days and even bring gifts. The woman then addressed them again, hesitating slightly over how to refer to Elle. Clarified that being called Elder Dwarf was unnecessary and that simply Elle was enough. The woman found the name curious, noting that it sounded similar to another girl's name, and concluded that it must be normal for demi-humans to refer to each other by race. That thought led her to realize that Kuina must be special for having a proper name. Those words struck Elle unexpectedly. She reflected inwardly, thinking about how the Master, the Demon King, had the power to name 3 demons and turn them into contracted demons. Those chosen ones became special beings acknowledged by the Master. She recognized that she still had no name. It became clear to her why she had not achieved the same level of success as Kuina during the evening gathering, nor did she possess that same level of strength. She wondered when the day would come when the Master would accept her and grant her a name. The thought lingered as she paused. Being a dwarf meant her role was to produce and create, not to stand out or act in flashy ways. She saw herself as someone who worked behind the scenes, a supporting figure. She accepted that role, believing it was enough as long as she could be useful to the Master. At that moment, White noticed her and approached, offering to listen if she had any concerns. Elle responded with a faint, restrained smile, brushing it off as nothing. Their exchange was cut short when someone suddenly demanded to know the location of the city's lord. Back in Avalon, within Procel's residence, White and Elle rushed inside without hesitation. They called out urgently to their master, Lord Procel. He turned toward them, caught off guard, with coffee spilling down his face, clearly startled by their sudden entrance and wishing they had at least knocked. White quickly explained that someone important had finally arrived, a merchant. Inside Procel's residence, within the drawing room, the merchant was guided in and took his place as the discussion began. He introduced himself as Kuina Cretrudo, a humble merchant from Eklaba. Procel regarded the introduction as overly modest, recognizing the Cretrudo company as the leading commercial firm in Eklaba, a massive enterprise known across the entire continent. Procel's attention briefly shifted to the side, recalling the long-haired merchant they had seen earlier on their way to Dantalion's tower. He considered whether that man had followed along because the area fell under his control, or perhaps he was serving as a capable bodyguard. Kuina casually admired the chair, noting its quality, and continued observing that the goods sold throughout the city were unlike anything he had encountered before. He wondered where such items had come from. Procel explained that they originated from a far eastern land across the ocean, though he chose not to reveal its name, stating only that everything had been brought from there. From behind a slightly open door, White quietly observed the meeting, noting with satisfaction that the conversation had started smoothly. He understood that by presenting the items as foreign imports, it provided a convenient explanation for their unfamiliarity and advanced nature. Elle, standing nearby and watching as well, acknowledged that their master had put considerable effort into preparing for negotiations. White added that he had also contributed to those preparations. Elle continued her observation, recognizing that the situation was progressing well. If a merchant were to establish a base in the city, it would lead to a rapid increase in both goods and visitors. The city would gain more activity and continue to grow. Moreover, having the Cretrudo company as a partner would be more beneficial than any other option. Back in the room, Procel remained focused, understanding that all that was left was to conclude the negotiation properly. He then revealed part of his background, acknowledging that he carried demi-human blood and had grown up facing persecution. After fleeing his village, he had built this city together with others who shared the same beliefs. Kuina reacted to that explanation, realizing that it was the reason demi-humans were present throughout the city. With that established, Prosel moved the discussion toward its main point. He assumed that, in most cases, their visit was for business negotiations, but he made it clear from the beginning that he intended to state his position first. Prosel made his position clear, rejecting any request to wholesale the city's goods to the outside or to share their trade secrets. As expected, that had been their main objective, and Kuina's expression briefly tightened at the refusal. He responded by pointing out how harsh the decision was, offering generous terms instead. He proposed buying swords from the city at 3 times their price, confident that his company could resell them in other cities for 5 times the value. He even suggested that if they were taught the methods of production, they would pay 1 gold coin for every sword sold. With their extensive network, he believed sales could increase 100-fold, even 1,000-fold. Prosel held his ground, showing clear irritation at the persistence. His goal was to draw people into the city and develop it from within, not to distribute its goods elsewhere. He had no intention of letting the city's items leave its boundaries. As Kuina tried to continue, Prosel cut in and shifted the direction of the discussion. Instead, he offered full support if Kuina chose to establish a business within the city itself. He began listing the conditions, starting with complete duty-free operations. The merchants reacted with visible shock, as such an arrangement was unheard of. Prosel explained that the city's management was already sustained by the sale of its unique local products, a situation made possible largely due to the assistance of demons. He continued by offering a house free of charge for setting up a store. If needed, he would also provide a golem to assist with transportation, recognizing that ordinary methods like horses would not be enough. The long-haired merchant remained silent as the offer unfolded. Kuina reacted with surprise at the mention of a golem. Prosel concluded by stating that all that remained was for their company to help develop the city, with any resulting profits becoming an added benefit. Kuina acknowledged how favorable the proposal was, noting that such extensive support required almost no initial investment. Prosel urged him to accept, framing it as compensation for refusing to allow their goods to be sold outside the city. Prosel, White, and L all showed quiet confidence, believing the negotiation had been secured by presenting overwhelmingly favorable terms. From a merchant's perspective, it seemed like an ideal opportunity. Kuina appeared convinced, expressing that although it was unfortunate they could not trade the swords, the conditions offered were more than sufficient. At that moment, the long-haired merchant finally spoke up, interrupting the flow of agreement. All attention turned toward him. He advised Kuina not to accept the conditions so easily. Kuina questioned the reasoning, and the man stepped forward toward Prosel, calmly stating his suspicion toward the city itself. Prosel reacted to the claim, questioning the idea that the city itself was suspicious. From the side, White and L observed the exchange with growing concern. Kuina quickly tried to stop the long-haired merchant, uneasy that such thoughts were being voiced just as the negotiations were about to conclude. The long-haired merchant remained calm, acknowledging the negotiation while keeping his focus. He turned his attention back to Prosel, bringing up the restriction on wholesaling the city's goods and pressing whether there was truly no room for reconsideration. Prosel understood that the discussion had returned to trade matters. He began to restate his position, but the long-haired merchant cut him off, warning him not to underestimate them. He explained that if they chose to act, they could use their own subordinates or even hire adventurers to purchase goods directly from the city. Those items could then be resold in Eklaba or other cities. In fact, they had already attempted this several times as an experiment. At the same time, they had people investigating resale rates and analyzing how the items were produced. L recalled seeing customers buying goods in large quantities, realizing the connection. The long-haired merchant continued, explaining that if such methods proved effective, then establishing a shop in such a remote location would have little value. Before reaching that point, he urged reconsideration. Kuina reacted with surprise, realizing these actions had already been carried out. The long-haired merchant clarified that it had been a precaution, an insurance measure in case the negotiations failed. Prosel steadied himself, forcing calm as he responded. He explained that countermeasures were already being prepared. Due to the limited supply of swords, they planned to enforce a strict limit of 1 sword per person. Anyone acting suspiciously would be blacklisted, and systems would be put in place to prevent further sales to them. He continued by addressing the issue of manufacturing. The swords were crafted by dwarves, and the crops carried blessings from elves, making replication difficult. However, the long-haired merchant interrupted again, focusing precisely on that point and pointing out that this was exactly what made the situation suspicious. Prosel's expression sharpened as the man continued, emphasizing that demi-humans such as elves and dwarves did, in fact, already exist on this continent. The long-haired merchant continued his reasoning, pointing out that while demi-humans did exist on the continent, those who resembled the ones in this city, beings of a much higher rank, were typically found only within dungeons. In truth, they were demons. At that realization, Prosel's eyes widened as a connection formed in his mind. It explained why they had been driven away when they visited Eklaba. The long-haired merchant pressed on, bringing up the mention of golems being used as labor. To him, that idea made no sense. Golems were known as monsters that attacked adventurers, not tools to be treated as manpower. They were not something people would normally view in that way. He then turned to Prosel's earlier explanation. Building a city for demi-humans due to having demi-human blood did not add up, especially when there was not a single individual who could truly be classified as one. On the surface, the city appeared peaceful, but when viewed differently, it became something else entirely. It resembled a demon lord's dungeon. The weight of those words struck both Elle and Prosel, their hearts racing as the situation became more dangerous. The long-haired merchant then pressed further, demanding to know Prosel's true identity. Prosel realized the severity of the situation. If it were discovered that he was a demon lord, and if the city were recognized as a dungeon, everything would collapse. Even without solid proof, the spread of such rumors would be enough for people to believe it. A company of this scale had the power to make that happen. If that occurred, the city's goods would no longer be seen as products but as treasures to be seized. Its citizens would not be viewed as residents, but as demons to be hunted. The city itself would be treated as a dungeon that consumed lives. That vision of chaos filled his mind. And with the dungeon core already established, abandoning it and starting over elsewhere was no longer an option. Lowering his gaze, he understood what was at stake. A city built on hope and happiness, sustained by those ideals, would come to ruin. The long-haired merchant then brought the discussion back to its conclusion, making it clear that everything now came down to business. He pushed once more for Prosel to accept granting them the rights to wholesale the city's goods. The long-haired merchant laid out the final condition, stating that the cost would be set at half of the selling price, even though they intended to distribute the goods at 10 times that value. Prosel was visibly shaken by how far the merchants were willing to push. He realized he had underestimated them. The choice before him became clear: either allow the city to be ruined and place everyone in danger, or yield to the advantage the merchants sought. He clenched his teeth, feeling the pressure closing in. At that moment, Elle and White entered the room, apologizing for interrupting the negotiation. They began serving the merchants, presenting apple sake as a specialty of the city and inviting them to try it. White explained that he had stepped in because he sensed the atmosphere had grown tense. Prosel acknowledged that the interruption had helped, but the problem still remained unresolved. He reminded himself that the merchants were ultimately pursuing profit, not destruction. This was still a negotiation. With that thought, he stood and reaffirmed his stance, once again declining the request for wholesaling rights. The long-haired merchant questioned whether he was truly willing to accept such an unfavorable position. Prosel remained firm, stating that his goal was to create a city where demi-humans could live peacefully. If that could not be achieved here, then he would simply move elsewhere. Internally, he knew this was nothing more than a bluff, as the dungeon system made such a move impossible. Still, he continued, turning the situation back on the merchants. If they walked away, they would be abandoning a major business opportunity. A city without tariffs was something unheard of elsewhere. Furthermore, the fact that they were still asking for wholesaling rights despite already researching the products showed that they were unable to recreate items of the same quality on their own. The long-haired merchant reacted with quiet interest, prompting Prosel to present a compromise. While he would not allow the wholesaling of the city's specialties, he would overlook goods produced by immigrants who settled there. He would not interfere with anyone learning the methods of production, even when it came to swords. If the merchants took the initiative to help the city grow, then the goods created by the people they brought in would be theirs to handle as they saw fit. The long-haired merchant raised an eyebrow as Kuina quietly considered the proposal. The terms meant that by supporting the city's growth, they would gain access to a tariff-free base of operations, one that could lead to significant profit. From that perspective, it sounded favorable. The long-haired merchant acknowledged the benefits, but his doubts had not completely disappeared. There were still risks on their side. He pressed for something more, asking for proof that Prosel could be trusted. Prosel reflected on the request, realizing they were already close to an agreement and questioning what more he could possibly provide. At that moment, Elle, who had been observing silently, suddenly left the room. She soon returned and placed the sword on the table, the very one displayed in front of the shop and never meant for sale. Prosel recognized it immediately. Elle presented it as something that contained everything she had devoted herself to, offering it up so that they could place their trust in her master. Prosel was deeply moved by her decision. Kuina picked up the sword, admiring its craftsmanship, recognizing its exceptional quality. The long-haired merchant also acknowledged the presence of strong magic within it, seeing it as a weapon worthy of being called a sacred sword. Prosel turned to Elle, uncertain, but she remained resolute, believing that even if she could not match Kuina's strength, she could at least contribute in this way. Kuina evaluated its worth, realizing that if it were put up for auction, it could easily reach 10,000 gold coins, an amount enough to purchase a castle. Despite lingering suspicions about the city, the value of the sword alone made the situation highly appealing. The long-haired merchant agreed that it was more than enough. However, instead of accepting it, he returned the sword to Elle, apologizing for making her bring out such an item. Both Kuina and Elle were caught off guard by his decision. Kuina questioned the action, seeing it as a missed opportunity to secure a valuable treasure. The long-haired merchant remained composed, reminding him that it was unwise to act greedily toward a client with whom they intended to maintain a long-term relationship. Kuina pointed out that the idea had originally come from him, but the merchant remained firm. He then explained the true weight of the sword. In the hands of someone capable of wielding it properly, it possessed enough power to easily destroy every demi-human in the city. The long-haired merchant acknowledged the meaning behind the gesture, recognizing that offering such a sword showed how serious they were about making the city prosper. He admitted that doubting them had been unnecessary. Prosel let out a quiet breath, expressing his appreciation that they had come to understand. The long-haired merchant gave a brief apology for interrupting earlier, though Kuina paid him little attention. Instead, Kuina focused on Prosel, deciding to move forward. He reached out and sealed the agreement, accepting the contract terms and confirming that from this point onward, they would advance together as partners. Once the merchants departed, the tension finally released. White, Prosel, and Elle all collapsed from exhaustion, the strain of the negotiation catching up to them. White remarked on how the long-haired merchant had kept them under pressure the entire time. Prosel admitted that he would not have been able to handle it alone. He expressed his gratitude toward both of them, especially toward Elle, whose resolve at the end had ultimately secured the outcome. Elle reacted with quiet surprise as Prosel continued. He explained that his gratitude had not started just now. He had long been thankful for her contributions, including how she had strengthened their combat capabilities during the evening gathering and how much of the city's infrastructure had been built through her efforts. He recognized that her presence was essential to them, and that he should have acknowledged her achievements much sooner. With that realization, he decided to act on it. He declared that she would become his second contracted demon, preparing to give her a name. At that moment, Kuina suddenly returned, interrupting the scene with her usual energy. She quickly noticed Elle's condition, commenting on how she seemed unusually happy. Elle responded calmly, correcting that she was no longer simply Elle. From that point on, her name was Rono. Kuina and the ancient elf repeated the name, letting it settle as something real. The ancient elf expressed that it was a good name, and Kuina offered her congratulations. Rono grew slightly flustered, holding onto the name she had received from Prosel with care, determined to treasure it. The ancient elf then shifted her gaze toward Prosel, lightly teasing him. She admitted feeling a bit jealous of Kuina and Rono, noting how it felt to be left out. At the same time, she acknowledged that both of them had earned their names through their efforts. Prosel turned the attention back to her, questioning her own case. The ancient elf responded with a casual laugh, mentioning that she had also contributed to the city in her own way. White stepped in, pointing out that there had been complaints from the high elves about her frequent absences, as she often wandered around town instead of staying in place. Yuko added that she had even caused discomfort through inappropriate behavior toward her. The ancient elf reacted awkwardly to this, unable to deny it outright. Prosel was taken aback by what he heard and called attention to her actions. The ancient elf clarified that her time outside was not spent merely playing around. She had been dealing with troublemakers who were targeting the city's apples. White began to respond to that matter but stopped himself midway, deciding not to bring it up further in that setting. Prosel looked at him with confusion. The ancient elf continued, admitting that she had not contributed as much as the other two. She proposed that once she accomplished something on the same level, she should also receive a name. She even suggested an example, casually mentioning the idea of defeating an opposing demon lord, which caused Prosel to react with unease. Prosel remarked on how unsettling such a suggestion sounded, especially given how casually it was delivered. Still, he admitted that if she truly achieved something of that scale, he would have no choice but to consider it. The ancient elf responded with visible delight, taking his words as a promise. Kuina confidently stated that after witnessing Prosel's strength during the evening gathering, no one would dare challenge him. Rono agreed, expressing hope that it would remain that way. Some time later, Prosel was seen outside, eating a burger while speaking with White. He reflected on how troublesome the ancient elf could be, admitting that he could not quite understand her nature, as she seemed unpredictable, like the wind. As he continued eating, White reassured him that despite everything she was likely a good person at heart. A dwarf smith approached them and brought up the matter they had discussed earlier. White responded immediately, confirming that everything was prepared. Prosel quietly observed the exchange, reflecting on how much effort White put into supporting the city. From the production of bread to the management of consumables and food sold throughout the city, White handled a wide range of responsibilities. Even the skeleton army had been organized under his direction to take care of cooking and processing. It was clear that White had become a central force in managing the city's operations. Beyond that, he had earned the trust of the dwarf smiths, the kitsune, and even the high elves. Despite Procel being the demon king, White had managed to gain more trust from the people than he had. As Procel watched further, another man approached White, mistaking him for the city's chief and asking for guidance regarding new immigrants. To Procel, it became a clear example of how difficult it was to tell who truly ruled the city, as people were beginning to misunderstand their roles. He considered the reason for this. Being hidden deep within the city, where the crystal was kept, focusing on maintaining its magic, likely contributed to the situation. In part, he acknowledged that it was his own doing. Procel stepped closer to White and brought up something that had been on his mind. Even though the ancient elf had been created in his image using the create metal, he still found her difficult to understand. In contrast, White, who had come into existence more by chance, had become someone he could trust completely. He expressed his reliance on White, who accepted it with quiet respect. As Procel reflected further, a sense of guilt surfaced. White worked tirelessly for the city, to the point that it felt as though he was being overburdened. If only he had been born with strength comparable to the others, he could have used even greater power in his role. After a brief silence, Procel asked White if he would want to receive a name. He continued by expressing that White was one of the most suitable candidates to become his final contracted demon. White stood there in shock at the unexpected offer. Procel continued, revealing something he had not yet shared with anyone else. As a reward for winning the evening gathering, he had been granted a special power by the creator. It could only be used twice, and with mutual agreement, it allowed a person to be turned into a metal while preserving their memories. As White listened, he gently placed a hand on the dwarf smith's head. Procel went on to explain that by using this ability, White could become a much stronger demon while still retaining who he was. White closed his eyes for a moment, showing quiet appreciation, then bowed deeply in gratitude for the concern shown toward him. As he straightened, he removed his mask and revealed his thoughts more clearly. He expressed that he truly cherished the body he had been given. Among the demons who stood beside their lord, he was the only one not shaped by the create power, yet even so, this body had led him to a meaningful and almost fated existence. He continued, expressing that he felt content and proud of who he was. Procel attempted to respond, but before he could continue, White respectfully interrupted, addressing him as his lord. He acknowledged that Procel would face many unexpected challenges ahead, and that the final name and the power granted by the creator would become crucial in overcoming those difficulties. Lowering his head once again, White urged him not to use such powers impulsively. Procel fell silent for a moment, then let out a quiet breath and smiled, accepting the outcome. He laughed lightly, admitting that he was no longer certain who truly held the upper hand between them. Even so, he raised a point, realizing there was still something unresolved. He had wanted to reward White for his efforts in supporting the city's management. In response, White offered a request of his own, suggesting that Procel act as a matchmaker for his marriage with Suk. At once, the dwarf smith reacted with excitement, unable to contain the sudden joy. Procel struggled to process what he had just heard, confusion spreading across his face before turning into shock. The dwarf smith, equally startled, tried to make sense of the situation, overwhelmed by the realization that White was planning to marry. White, now slightly embarrassed, confirmed it, admitting that his feelings had been returned. Procel reacted with disbelief at the idea of an undead entering into marriage, then paused and accepted it, acknowledging that if White was satisfied, then there was no reason to object. The dwarf smith remained stunned, still trying to take in the unexpected turn of events. White showed clear delight, unable to hide his excitement, and felt honored by the outcome. He quickly moved on to practical matters, wondering when the ceremony should take place. The dwarf smith reacted loudly, calling out to him in excitement. Procel, meanwhile, accepted the idea of a relationship involving demons, though the thought of unexpected hardships lingered in his mind. As he walked toward the village, he reflected on the current state of things. The city's development had been progressing smoothly, and he hoped that nothing would disrupt that peace. Still, the possibility of trouble remained at the back of his thoughts. Before long, that concern became reality in a way he had not anticipated. Procel suddenly found himself face to face with three demon lords. They were the demon lord of evil, Morax, the demon lord of steel, Zagan, and the demon lord of viscosity, Rono. One of them recognized him immediately and made their intent clear. They had come to challenge him, declaring war against the demon lord of creation, Procel. The situation left no room for doubt. It had become a 3-against-1 war. Some time earlier, Procel sat in his office, going through stacks of paperwork. He reviewed documents related to proposals for merchants and the people who had recently settled in the city. As he worked through them, the weight of responsibility became clear, and he quietly reflected on how difficult it was to lead a city. Amid his work, something unusual caught his attention. He noticed an envelope and realized it carried a trace of magic. The moment stood out immediately. Kuina approached and identified the meaning behind it, recognizing that such a letter could only come from another demon lord. Rono examined it as well, considering who it might be from, thinking of familiar figures like Marcho or Stolas. However, White quickly dismissed that idea, pointing out that those two had their own established methods of contacting Prosel. That left only one conclusion: it had come from someone else entirely. With that realization, a sense of caution settled in, and White urged Prosel to remain alert. In the commercial city of Eklaba, Prosel stood with a piece of paper in hand, scanning his surroundings as he searched for the designated meeting place. He was certain he had arrived at the correct location, recalling that it had been specified clearly. As he turned, someone addressed him, confirming his arrival. The man expressed appreciation for him coming and identified him as the Demon Lord of Creation. Prosel immediately recognized the implication and questioned whether this was the sender of the letter. The man revealed himself to be Zagan, the Demon Lord of Steel. Zagan carried himself with ease, gesturing for Prosel to take a seat before calling over a waitress and ordering the same drink for him. As Prosel observed the situation, he noted how naturally Zagan handled the setting, as if he were entirely accustomed to such environments. Zagan lifted his coffee and shifted the conversation without delay, deciding to move past any formalities. His focus turned directly to the main subject. His expression sharpened as he brought up the matter of war, informing Prosel in advance that he had already formed an alliance with two other demon lords. The word lingered in Prosel's thoughts as he processed it, realizing that such alliances were possible. Zagan continued, acknowledging Prosel's strength as the Demon Lord of Creation, but questioning how he would fare against three opponents. He also pointed out that Prosel's demons had become widely known following the evening gathering. Prosel considered the implication, questioning whether this was meant as a demand for surrender. Zagan reacted with a light, mocking tone before presenting an alternative. Instead of forcing submission, he proposed forming an alliance. Prosel was taken aback by the unexpected suggestion, struggling to understand the shift. Zagan explained further, revealing that his two allies were currently stationed elsewhere. If Prosel rejected the offer, a signal would summon them instantly, allowing all three to declare war against him at once. However, he then laid out a different path. If Prosel agreed to ally with him after those two initiated the conflict, Zagan would turn against his own allies and declare war on them instead. The proposal left Prosel stunned. Zagan clarified the outcome, explaining that the situation would change from a 3-against-1 battle into a 2-against-2. He added that the other two demon lords were considered weaker within their generation, and that with both himself and Prosel fighting together, victory would be well within reach. Zagan laid out the benefits clearly. By following this approach, they could obtain medals without putting in excessive effort and complete the war mandated by the creator within the 1-year limit. Prosel remained silent for a moment, absorbing the proposal, before questioning why such a plan should even be considered. To Zagan, the answer was simple: it was the more advantageous option. He explained that the condition for fulfilling the war duty was the destruction of the opponent's crystal. Even if 3 demon lords fought together and won, the remaining 2 would still be forced to wage war afterward. From Prosel's perspective, it seemed far easier to defeat weaker opponents rather than engage in battle against a strong enemy. Zagan countered that, from Prosel's side, it would still be safer than facing a 3-against-1 situation. However, he added a condition to the alliance: Prosel would have to promise not to initiate war again even after the 1-year obligation was fulfilled. Prosel fell silent again, realizing that this was the true reason Zagan had approached him. The plan was efficient and, on the surface, beneficial to both sides. Zagan moved forward, expecting agreement, but Prosel interrupted and made his decision clear. He rejected the offer. The refusal caught Zagan off guard. Prosel explained his reasoning plainly. There was no trust to be found in someone willing to betray their own allies without hesitation. A person like that could not be relied upon, as there would always be the risk of being struck from behind. He went further, considering that even this proposal itself could be a trap. Zagan tried to respond, but Prosel pressed the point, noting that he had just demonstrated that very behavior toward his current allies. The tension shifted immediately. Zagan began to show signs of unease, sweat forming as the situation slipped from his control. Unable to maintain his composure, Zagan stood up and declared that Prosel would come to regret this decision. Without hesitation, he moved to summon the other 2 demon lords. In an instant, 2 more demon lords appeared behind Zagan. He turned toward Prosel with a dark, satisfied expression. One of them was a heavy-set figure, introduced as the Demon Lord of Viscosity, Rono, while the other was the Demon Lord of Evil, Morix. Zagan took pleasure in the situation, drawing attention to the fact that 3 demon lords now stood before Prosel. Prosel remained silent, offering no reaction, which only irritated Zagan further as he pressed for a response. Instead of answering directly, Prosel shifted his focus to the 2 newly arrived demon lords and pointed out Zagan's earlier actions, revealing that he had just attempted to betray them. The statement caused both Ronov and Morix to turn their attention toward Zagan in surprise. Zagan quickly tried to recover, speaking in a rushed and uneasy manner as he attempted to dismiss the accusation. He insisted that they should not be misled and warned that falling into conflict among themselves would only benefit Prosel. Regaining his urgency, he pushed them to act, urging them to proceed with declaring war against the demon lord of creation. Ronov hesitated, uncertain of what they should do, while Morix noted that it was already too late to dwell on internal disagreements. With that, the three demon lords moved forward together and formally declared their challenge against Prosel, turning the situation into a 3-against-1 war. At that moment, everything came to a halt as another presence made itself known. A voice confirmed the challenge, granting approval. Prosel immediately recognized it as the creator, understanding that the declaration had been accepted. The creator then set the terms, announcing that the war would begin in 4 days. The terms of the war were laid out clearly. It would be the demon lord of creation against the allied forces of steel, viscosity, and evil. The time limit was set at 24 hours, and victory would be decided by the number of crystals each side possessed at the end. Prosel reacted immediately, unable to hide his frustration at the sudden conditions. A time limit and a victory determined by crystal count were rules he had never been informed of. The creator confirmed that this was indeed the case, explaining that such details had not been introduced before. In a typical war, something like the white space used during the evening gathering would be employed. However, deploying multiple dungeons at the same time placed an immense burden, which was why the time restriction had been imposed. Prosel clenched his teeth, the situation growing increasingly unfavorable in his mind. He quickly assessed the conditions and realized how dangerous they were for him. In a standard dungeon battle, the defending side held the advantage, and his forces were built around strong defensive capabilities. His usual strategy relied on drawing enemies into his dungeon and confronting them with that defensive strength. But under these new rules, that approach was no longer viable. Prosel glanced toward Zagan, recognizing that his opponent had already understood the same thing. The restriction, explained as a matter of excessive load, applied even at the level of the creator. That realization only made the situation more difficult. Looking upward, Prosel directed his thoughts toward the creator, questioning the reason behind forcing newly appointed demon lords to wage war within their first year. The response came without hesitation. It was dismissed as a pointless question. The purpose was simple. The creator wished to witness demon lords clashing and competing over crystals. As long as that outcome was achieved, the exact form of the conflict did not matter. With that answer, Prosel came to a clear conclusion. The entire system existed for the creator's amusement, to watch demon lords fight against one another. Back in Prosel's mansion, the tension rose immediately as the situation was laid out. Kuina reacted first, grabbing her hair in distress as she struggled to accept that the battle had become a 3-against-1 confrontation. Rono followed, pointing out that there was also a time limit imposed on top of it. Prosel responded with unease, explaining that the conditions had been decided by the creator and could not be changed. The situation was clearly stacked against them. The timing only made things worse. The next creation medal would not be ready until several hours after the war had already begun, leaving no room for meaningful reinforcements. He continued, emphasizing another crucial difference. Unlike the evening gathering, any demons who fell in this battle would not return. The weight of that reality settled over them. Rono immediately shifted her focus toward protecting their allies, stressing the need to take measures to prevent losing their comrades. In the middle of this, Prosel's attention was suddenly drawn elsewhere. Someone had appeared before them. The unexpected presence caught him off guard. The figure explained that she had come to check on him, and seeing the situation, it had proven to be the right decision. She had already learned what had happened. She then made her position clear. If their enemies were forming an alliance, then they would do the same. The one who stepped forward was the demon lord of wind, Stolas, declaring that she would join the fight alongside them. On the morning of the war, Prosel stood outside his residence, stretching as he prepared himself. His attention was soon drawn to something unusual in the distance. Others began to notice it as well. The sky was gradually turning white, an unnatural shift that caught everyone off guard. Kuina looked up in confusion, trying to understand what was happening. Suddenly, the human mage standing beside her vanished without warning. The abrupt disappearance startled her, and panic quickly followed. Prosel rushed toward them, calling for Kuina and Rono. Rono pointed out the change in the sky, while Kuina, still shaken, realized that the humans around them had disappeared entirely. As they moved to gather everyone, Prosel explained what had taken place. They had been transported into the white space created by the creator, the same type of battlefield used during the evening gathering. When this space was deployed, everything except the demon lords and their demons was sent into a separate dimension, and time itself was halted. From the perspective of managing a city, this mechanism worked in their favor. Kuina looked around, taking in the empty surroundings. Prosel continued, explaining that he had already used a floor swap to switch the city with the dungeon. Without doing so, the city would have been destroyed the moment the war began. With all preparations in place, he narrowed his focus. The only thing left now was to win the war. The participants stood facing one another, their presence marking the start of the conflict. The demon lord of creation, Prosel, stood against the alliance of the demon lord of steel, Zagan, the demon lord of evil, Morax, and the demon lord of viscosity, Rono. The creator addressed them, recognizing this as the first commemorative war of their generation, the children of the stars. The matchup itself was unusual, with creation standing against an alliance of three. However, with the addition of the demon lord of wind, the balance shifted slightly, turning it into a 2-against-3 confrontation. Regardless, the creator found the irregular nature of the battle to be particularly interesting for a first round. The conditions were restated. The time limit was set at 24 hours, and victory would be determined by which side held the greater number of crystals when time expired. Combat within the white space itself was prohibited, and all battles were restricted to the dungeons. With that, the creator called upon them to demonstrate their strength, signaling the beginning of the war. Zagan stood with anticipation, having long awaited such a moment. The rejection of his proposal still lingered, fueling his resolve. He tightened his grip, determined to make Prosel experience loss, despair, and complete defeat. His frustration extended to the demon lord of wind as well, viewing her refusal as an insult, especially given his belief that his own ability to create only B-rank demons was being mocked. He had originally planned to launch a surprise attack, destroy her crystal, and seize her ability to produce wind-based metals. As these thoughts ran through his mind, Strauss became aware of the intensity of his gaze. Zagan, however, remained focused on his own resentment, convinced that others continued to look down on him. He held on to his confidence, believing that in the end his resourcefulness would allow him to control the situation entirely. A faint smirk formed as he envisioned the outcome, certain that once Prosel's crystal was destroyed, he would force him into submission before ending everything decisively. Stolas turned her attention toward Prosel as the war began, acknowledging the situation before them. Forming a proper alliance beforehand would have been preferable, but since the declaration had already been made, she had no choice but to prioritize protecting her own dungeon. Even so, she chose to lend her support personally. Prosel accepted her presence with a calm expression, recognizing that her assistance alone was more than enough. With her ability to create clones, their effective strength had, in simple terms, doubled. That alone helped cover one of their greatest concerns. In addition, having someone who commanded the Emerald Dragon standing by to protect his crystal room in case of emergencies brought him reassurance. Stolas was momentarily at a loss, but Prosel placed a hand on her shoulder, making it clear that her arrival was a significant help. He intended to properly thank her in the future, even planning to invite her to his city. He also made it clear that if she ever found herself in trouble, he would be willing to support her in return. Stolas reacted with quiet satisfaction, accepting the sentiment. Kuina stepped forward, turning her attention to the immediate situation and prompting Prosel for the plan. He began laying it out clearly. Since victory would be determined by both the time limit and the number of crystals remaining, they needed to secure at least 2 enemy dungeons. At the same time, regardless of whether their movements were noticed, the enemy would almost certainly launch an attack on Prosel's dungeon while its defenses were weakened. From that, he formed a counter-strategy. They would move quickly, capturing 2 dungeons with overwhelming speed, and then launch a pincer attack against whichever demon lord attempted to invade their own dungeon. The goal was to defeat that opponent decisively. The main attacking force would consist of 2 units, centered around Prosel, the ancient elf, Kuina, and Rono. Each unit would be supported by one of Dantalion's demons capable of using teleportation and duplication. One such copy landed lightly atop Rono's head, ready to assist. By placing a teleportation marker inside Prosel's dungeon, they would be able to return immediately after securing a capture. If they could establish such markers within the white space itself, their options would expand significantly, but that was not possible under the current conditions. Stolas quickly understood the limitation. Prosel then shifted focus to defense. The core of their defensive strategy would rely on the path guarded by the golem, the same one that had been used during their previous battle against Stolas. If the enemy managed to break through that point, Prosel placed his trust in White. White acknowledged the responsibility, assuring that the army under his command would form a defense that could not be easily penetrated. Prosel remained confident that even if their opponents had some understanding of their strategy, victory was still within reach. With that, he gave the signal to begin, and the others responded with determination as the plan was set into motion. Kuina accepted the plan overall but could not hide her frustration at being separated from Prosel. Meanwhile, inside the dungeon of the demon lord of viscosity, Rono and Kuina found themselves within a cavern. Rono interpreted their assignment as a sign of trust, taking pride in being entrusted with such a role. Kuina observed her, noting how composed she seemed. Their movement came to a halt when they encountered a large group of monsters. There were many, at least 50 gathered ahead of them. Rono recognized the setup, understanding that the enemy had concentrated their forces near the entrance to prepare for a counterattack. This arrangement threatened to slow them down. Kuina immediately dismissed the delay, recalling the instruction to act as quickly as possible. Without hesitation, she began preparing a spell. Rono reacted in surprise as she noticed something unusual. Each strand of Kuina's tail carried a significant amount of magical energy, comparable to that of a rank B entity. Kuina revealed that she had been storing magic within them all this time, a technique made possible by their life within the city. There were 120 strands in total, and she chose to activate 30 at once. As she prepared the attack, she signaled for awareness, channeling power drawn from Procel's abilities. The spell was unleashed, and a massive explosion followed. Inside his dungeon, Rono watched the destruction unfold through his crystal. The sight left him stunned. Every demon stationed on the first floor had been wiped out in a single attack. The scale of the power was something he had not anticipated. Panic quickly overtook him as fear set in. Desperation grew, pushing him toward a decision he had hoped to avoid, as he broke down under the pressure, seeking any form of help. The war had been set as a 3-against-1 confrontation targeting the demon lord of creation. A strict time limit of 24 hours had been imposed. The source of each demon lord's power lay within their crystal, and victory would be determined by which side retained the greater number of crystals. It was an unusual set of rules, forcing each side to destroy at least 2 opponents' crystals to secure an advantage. In response, Procel's side chose a strategy that balanced defense and offense. Their plan was to fortify their own dungeon while sending out attackers to swiftly capture enemy dungeons. Once the opposing forces entered Procel's territory, they would be struck from behind, creating a pincer attack. Rono summarized the situation, recognizing the urgency of conquering enemy dungeons as quickly as possible. As they advanced, both she and Kuina paused upon reaching the entrance of a cave. Rono sensed a strong presence from deeper within, identifying it as the likely location of the crystal. Kuina realized that this must be the final floor and reacted with surprise at how quickly they had reached it. Rono agreed, noting that the demons and traps along the way had been too weak to slow them down. Even considering that both sides were demon lords, the difference in strength was clear. She glanced at the bag she carried, thinking she might not have needed to bring it at all. Kuina grew curious and focused on the item. Rono clarified that it was not a weapon, but something tied to the power she had gained after receiving her name. It was an ability that had awakened within her as a contracted demon, something she considered her trump card. Before they could proceed further, Kuina suddenly sensed danger and rushed forward. Rono reacted just in time as an attack came from above. They narrowly avoided it, and Kuina immediately responded by firing her weapon. Even so, the attack failed to penetrate its target, leaving her momentarily stunned. In the next instant, monsters descended from above and surrounded them, closing in from all directions. Rono identified the enemies immediately, recognizing them as gargoyles. Among them, the first attacker stood out, a white one formed from orichalcum. Kuina stared in amazement, surprised that something made of or could move so freely, wondering if it was similar to the golem Rono used. Rono quickly clarified the difference. That being was not a construct but a living entity, a demon far stronger than a typical golem. The realization unsettled her. A dungeon created by the demon lord of viscosity should not have been capable of producing something at that level. The inconsistency raised questions she could not yet answer. Their thoughts were interrupted as a gargoyle lunged forward. Kuina reacted instantly. Realizing that her gun might not be effective, she shifted to flames, unleashing an attack that engulfed the enemy. However, the gargoyle pushed through, striking back with force. Kuina narrowly avoided the blow but found herself caught off guard. Rono stepped in and fired, her shots striking true and bringing down the advancing gargoyles. Kuina regrouped beside her, surprised that Rono's weapon had worked, noticing that the non-white gargoyles were less durable. Rono raised her voice, reminding Kuina that these enemies were composed of or, meaning incomplete attacks would not be enough. Kuina laughed it off, admitting she had already suspected that. Suddenly, Kuina sensed a surge of power above them. One of the gargoyles was gathering an immense amount of magic. Recognizing it as the true threat, she moved forward decisively. Conventional weapons and flames had proven ineffective against the white one, but she pressed on regardless. The gargoyle unleashed its attack, summoning a meteor. Kuina responded without hesitation, unlocking her weapon and firing at full capacity. The impact caused a massive explosion, shaking the surroundings. Kuina immediately called out, checking on Rono. After a brief moment, Rono confirmed she was unharmed, having avoided the direct impact. It appeared that the enemy could not withstand the full force of Kuina's weapon. Even so, Rono carefully assessed the situation. The power behind that attack was overwhelming. Any gargoyle caught within it had been destroyed instantly. This was no ordinary A-rank demon. It carried strength that suggested countless battles, approaching that of an S-rank. Rono focused on Kuina, asking how much more power she could exert. Kuina admitted that while she could handle the remaining black gargoyles, she had little confidence against the white one. Rono accepted that and made her decision. She would take on the white gargoyle herself. Kuina immediately objected, recognizing that Rono was not suited for direct combat. Rono calmly set down her bag, reminding Kuina of the ability she had mentioned earlier. It was her hidden strength. Kuina understood and stepped back, leaving the white gargoyle to her while drawing the attention of the others. Rono began to activate the power she had gained after receiving her name from Prosel. Pieces of equipment emerged from her pack and assembled around her. Light enveloped her form as the transformation took place. Kuina glanced back and was stunned by what she saw. Rono had transformed into a mechanized Valkyrie. The sight left Kuina wide-eyed in disbelief. Rono responded with a light sense of satisfaction, noting that Kuina's own transformed state had been just as surprising. With that, she prepared herself, signaling the start of the next phase of their battle. As they stood against the remaining gargoyles, Kuina shifted her stance, ready to continue the fight as the next phase began. Elsewhere, Rono had fallen to his knees, trembling as he stared into his crystal. The chaos unfolding within his dungeon filled him with fear, and he could do nothing but pray in desperation. Deep within the chamber where his crystal was kept, his thoughts drifted to the past, recalling how the demon lord who had once been his parent had abandoned him. Not long before this, he had spoken with Zagan of Steel. He had tried to retrieve the contracted demons he had lent out, recognizing that their strength was far beyond what he could handle. However, Zagan had refused, making it clear that those demons were necessary to break through the golems mentioned during the evening gathering. Instead, he had left Ronov to endure the situation on his own, suggesting that the gargoyles he had obtained, despite bending certain rules, should be enough. Back in the dungeon, Kuina unleashed her vermilion gold dance once more, cutting through the black gargoyles and eliminating most of them in a single sweep. Rono acknowledged her strength while preparing herself, determined not to fall behind. She moved toward the white gargoyle, recognizing its speed as it darted through the air. Even so, she adjusted her aim and fired. The shot struck its wing, shattering part of the orichalcum structure. Kuina reacted with amazement at the impact, but her attention quickly shifted as the white gargoyle lunged forward in retaliation. The creature closed in rapidly, delivering a powerful strike that sent both it and Rono crashing toward the ground. Rono reacted just in time, blocking the attack while redirecting her weapons. With all her guns aimed directly at the enemy, she unleashed a decisive counterattack. The blast struck the gargoyle's head, destroying it completely. Watching through his crystal, Ronov's fear deepened. The outcome was unfolding exactly as he had feared. In desperation, he clung to the belief that Zagan would uphold his word, recalling how he had been assured of safety and victory. But that hope quickly crumbled. Zagan had never intended to protect him. Instead, Ronov had simply been used, his trust taken advantage of without hesitation. Ronov realized too late that if he had known such powerful demons were involved, he would never have agreed to cooperate. As panic set in, his attention shifted to the crystal. The golems that had been guarding it were suddenly gone, and before he could process what was happening, the crystal shattered right in front of him. A cry escaped him as everything collapsed at once. Moments later, Rono stepped into the chamber, her large weapon still releasing smoke from the shot that had destroyed the crystal. It was clear that the attack had been enough to end it. Kuina and Rono approached him. Rono raised her weapon and demanded answers, her tone leaving no room for delay. Ronov trembled, unable to respond immediately. She pressed further, questioning the presence of such a powerful gargoyle within the dungeon and making it clear that she had little patience left. Before he could answer, the dungeon itself began to shift. With the crystal destroyed, everything around them started to collapse. Ronov clenched his fists, overwhelmed by frustration and despair. He could not understand why he alone had to suffer through this. The demon lord he once relied on had abandoned him, and those he believed to be his allies had done the same. The realization weighed heavily on him. The demons he had considered friends were gone, and his dungeon was on the verge of complete destruction. Looking down, he questioned why things had turned out this way, but the answer came to him clearly. He had been too trusting. Just as Zagan had implied, he had been nothing more than a fool, someone who placed everything in the hands of another without question. His thoughts were interrupted as Rono called out to him, demanding his attention. When he looked up, something in his expression had changed. He steadied himself and chose to speak, deciding to reveal everything he knew. As Rono listened, the information shocked her. If what Ronov said was true, then the situation was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. She turned immediately, realizing they needed to return at once. However, when she looked over, she found Kuina lying on the ground, fast asleep from exhaustion. Her transformation had already been released. Rono tried to wake her, but the situation only made her sigh, her concern shifting toward Procel's safety. At the same time, inside the dungeon of the demon lord of evil, Morix, Procel reacted with frustration, striking the wall as he realized they had been outmaneuvered. His focus turned toward the ancient elf. Nearby, Morix watched with satisfaction as the ancient elf was trapped by his monsters. A sense of excitement overtook him as he struggled to contain himself any longer.